Hello everybody and welcome to level 1 and part 1 of this divine magic guide for Baldur's Gate and Baldur's Gate 2. This is a continuation of the arcane magic guide that I did, which covered all levels of arcane spellcasting with the exception of wild magic. Now I'm turning to the divine book and I'm going to go through eventually all the levels of spells in the divine book and talk about them in the same way that I did the spells in the arcane book. This could take a number of years to do, but there's only one place to start, and that is with level 1. So that's what we're going to cover in this video. Now, I'm going to spend a little bit of time at the outset of this video covering a few different things about how divine magic is different from arcane magic, and thus how I'm going to think about these spells. First, overall, I'm going to look at the spells the same way I did the spells in the arcane book, with some exceptions I'll get to. But I'm going to talk about how each spell works. I'm going to talk about what's good from a power gaming perspective. And I'm going to rate each spell from 1 to 10, with a 1 out of 10 rating being one of the few worst spells in the game that I don't see any reason to ever use. And a 10 out of 10 spell being one of the few game-changing or breaking spells that represents a huge power spike when obtained. And it's not necessarily the case that there's going to be a 10 out of 10 spell anywhere in the divine book. I'm just not sure yet. But I'm going to keep to the same standards that I did in the arcane book. And overall, arcane magic is simply stronger than divine magic. So that may mean that there's the divine spells average a bit lower on this 10-point scale, or maybe just that there's no 10 out of 10 divine spells, but TBD. I don't want to get ahead of myself. Now, as to mods, or what mod set I'm going to talk about, this is a difference versus how I looked at the arcane book. For the divine book, I play with SCS with almost all components maxed, and I try to play no death runs. If I die, then I start back in Candlekeep. I've been sticking to that lately. So I feel like versus when I did the Arcane series, I'm now much more familiar with playing with that play style of never die. I still play mostly solo runs, but I'll talk about these spells from a party play perspective. But the fact that I solo most of the time is probably going to bias what I say. And the difference as to how I'm going to look at the divine book versus arcane, the main difference is that when I do this divine guide, I'm going to be talking about from the SCS perspective, not the base game perspective. In the arcane guide, I talked about how the spells worked out in SCS, but it was mainly a base game guide. For divine, I'm going to focus on SCS, not just because I've been playing that mostly lately, but also because SCS introduces these Icewind Dale divine spells that really change the divine book a lot. I think in a good way. In the base game, the divine school of magic is far inferior to the arcane school of magic. There's basically no way that divine magic is better than arcane, and mages in the base game are much tankier than divine casters, which doesn't really make sense. It's not that great for game balance or dynamics or variety if arcane magic is the best offensive and defensive spell school. And I would argue that's still the case post-SCS, but SCS brings the two classes much closer together and gives divine casters a variety of really important spells that allow divine casters with SCS to be maybe comparably tanky to mages and allow divine casters to be very solid fighters with SCS, mainly in the form of a variety of protections and self-buffs that the Icewind Dale spells add to the divine book. So in my view, there's not really any point to doing a base game only divine guide, just because that would be so different than SCS. Probably most viewers of this are playing with SCS and are hardcore Baldur's Gate nerds like me. So I think it's just much better to talk about the divine book from the SCS perspective, because SCS changes so much in a good way, and it would be a completely different review if I didn't include the SCS spells. So this is going to be from the SCS perspective and including the Icewind Dale spells and other spells that SCS adds into the divine book. Okay, next. The last clarification I'll add before I just get into some background on how I think about divine versus arcane magic. So I'm not going to cover the Druid book, and I'm just not very experienced playing with Druids. The Druid book adds a lot of different spells, although Druids have access to fewer spells than clerics overall. I'm not going to cover the Druid spells, in part because I feel like that's a sort of a different guide. When I'm doing these ratings, I'm oftentimes talking about the relative value of spells. Like, it's not that useful to just talk about something being good or bad when you have to make choices and you have a fixed amount of spell slots like you do in Baldur's Gate. And I think it would be completely different how I would rate these spells in a Druid guide versus a Priest guide because of the differing availability of spells at different levels. For example, Druid level 5, level 5 divine magic is generally quite strong, but Druid level 5 in particular is really strong because of Insect Plague and Iron Skins. So a Druid level 5 rating would have much different ratings versus how I'd rate the Priest level 5 spells. Like, sort of the value of everything in the Priest book or the Cleric book would drop a little if it was a Druid that had access to those spells and had to pit them against taking Insect Plague or Iron Skins. So that's just an example, but I don't feel like I could do a fair guide if I was just lumping all the spells together, when that's not how the game forces you to play. There's two different books. So maybe I'll come back later and do a Druid guide. I mean, the other thing is that most of the action is in the Priest or the Cleric book, not the Druid book. I mean, I can make a Druid guide in 2 sentences. Take Iron Skins and take Insect Plague and the level 7 version of Insect Plague. Okay, there you go. There's your Druid guide. Otherwise, the same spells are pretty much good. There's not that much other than Creeping Doom, Insect Plague, and Iron Skins in the Druid book that really is much different. Okay, that's out of the way. So I'm going to be talking about the Priest book, the Cleric book, not the Druid book. I'm not going to cover Druid spells in this guide, but that still leaves a ton of spells to cover. All right, let's get going. And I'd like to, before I start running through the level 1 Divine book for Priests, I'd like to just talk a little bit about some critical differences between the Cleric or Priest class and book and arcane magic, or the mage spells that I just went through in the other series. Because the differences between these classes is going to really affect what's a good spell for a priest versus a good spell for a mage, and what the limitations and strengths of the priest class are. So I'll start with just high level, who can cast divine spells? Well, the priest book can be cast by priests or clerics and paladins up to level 4. Paladins get access to divine spells out of the priest/cleric book, although at a slower level progression, and they're capped out at level 4 spells. And then separately, druids also cast divine spells, obviously, but in addition to druids, rangers and shamans also get access to the druid set of spells. Plus, shamans get access to 7 shaman-specific spells. Not talking about shamans or druids here, but just to set this table for who gets access to what spells. It's priests and paladins up to level 4 out of the priest book, and then druids, rangers up to level 3, and shamans plus shaman-specific spells out of the druid book. Okay, the differences versus arcane magic. First, no Robe of Vecna. Robe of Vecna is the most powerful item in the game. It reduces spellcast time by 4. That's a massive difference. For clerics, when you look at spellcast time, what you see is what you get. If there's a spell that takes a cast time of 9 to cast, that's going to put your druid standing in place casting for eons. There's no way to shorten it. If there's a priest spell that has a cast time of 4 or 5, then that's always going to take 4 or 5 tenths of a round to cast. It's always going to sideline your priest and prevent them from moving or doing an auto attack. There's no way around that. There's no Robe of Vecna. You can shorten spellcast time slightly by having your priest wear Amulet of Power, but unless you're doing solo play, then probably putting Amulet of Power on a Divine Caster is not the best use of Amulet of Power. That should go on an Arcane Caster. But the bottom line is no Robe of Vecna, and thus what you see is what you get as far as spell cast time. Also, relatedly, there's no Improved Alacrity. Improved Alacrity is an amazing game dynamic in the Arcane book because it brings back to relevance by TOB all of the level 1, 2, and 3 spells that you stopped casting because you couldn't take a whole round to use your action for the round to cast that spell because the spell's not powerful enough to use an action on it. When you get Improved Alacrity as a mage, now, especially combined with spell cast time reducing items, the level 1 through 5 spell book suddenly becomes very easy to use again because you can cast all those spells instantly when you unload your spell book with Improved Alacrity. So in the mage book, low level spells tend to have much more staying power and be much stronger later in the saga because there's no opportunity cost to casting them. You can cast them instantly inside a Improved Alacrity and doesn't take your action for the round. For the priest book, this will come up repeatedly, but especially for offensive spells, it's very, very hard to ever cast a low-level divine spell during battle because you're going to use up your entire action, you're going to take spell cast time, and that's taking your priest out of the battle and also taking away the opportunity to cast a much higher level spell. So generally, the ratings that I give to low-level spells out of the priest book are probably going to be lower overall than the ones in the Arcane book. Low-level priest spells don't have much scalability because you don't want to give up auto attacks. Priests are better fighters than mages, and you have no way to avoid using your entire action for the round to cast a spell. So when you get to TOB, you're using Implosion every time or Entropy Shield or what have you, level 5, 6, and 7 spells, instead of ever going back to level 1 through 3 for the most part to cast a spell. So no Improved Alacrity is actually a major change to how low-level spells work in the spellbook. Overall, Divine Magic is a weaker form of magic that's lacking in a lot of the strongest arcane-type spells. There's less damage, the single target's buffs are weaker, it lacks game-breaking mechanics like Alacrity, Wish, or Improved Haste altogether. But there is some great stuff in the Divine book. A couple other differences, I already covered this briefly, but Icewind Dale spells coming in through SCS do make a massive difference in the Divine book, which is why I'm going to do this guide from a SCS perspective, whereas in the Arcane book, the few spells that are added by SCS basically make no difference. They're sort of like weaker second-tier damage spells that wouldn't be your first choice anyway. Divine casters also do level up faster, getting access to higher level spells, more hit points, more Thackle reductions, much faster than arcane casters. Scroll availability is not an issue. So obviously I'll never be talking about a spell being pretty good, but it being hard to find a scroll. Like that's an issue with like mass invisibility. It's an issue with Wish in the Arcane book. But obviously since Divine Magic is all innate, you get access to all spells as soon as you reach the level where you get access to that spellcasting level. Scroll availability is not going to be an issue. The next difference between Divine and Arcane Magic is Divine casters have more spell slots. And on top of having more spell slots than Arcane casters to begin with, Divine casters also get the benefit that their wisdom scores can add bonus spell slots, resulting in many, many more spell casting slots for Divine casters, ignoring the impact of Wish and refreshing the spellbook. Once you get to late TOB, Arcane Magic has, in theory, infinite spell slots if your Wish luck is decent. But for almost the entire saga, your Divine casters are going to have more spells, more spell slots. Mages are capped at 5 spells per level, or 6 slots for specialists and sorcerers, plus the 3 from the HLAs for extra level 6, 7, and 8 spell. Divine casters, on the other hand, go up to 9 spells per level. And at the TOB level cap, just to illustrate the difference, a maxed non-specialist mage will have 43 spell slots across 9 levels. A maxed priest, on the other hand, will have 60 spell slots. A druid would have 59, and that's before the wisdom bonuses. A 25 wisdom will add an extra 20 spells to the divine book, resulting in a max divine caster having 80 spells if a priest and 79 if a druid. So that's almost 2 times the non-specialist mage, right? Non-specialist mage will have 43 spells, priest gets 80. Because of the higher number of spell slots in the divine book, the increased fighting power of divine casters who have a much better Thaco table and have access to more weapons, and no spell cast time reducing items. The key question for priests will become whether it's worth using your casting time or action for the round to cast a spell. It's less so a scarcity of slots, at least once you reach very late game. Like by the time you're resting, typically by late BG2 or SOA, it's because you want to regain health, or mostly because you want to regain your arcane slots, which are more precious. Your divine casters rarely are emptying their spell books. The other factor, and the last thing I'll talk about in the difference between divine and arcane magic, in theory, this should make this divine guide shorter, but the divine book simply has less spell variety than the arcane book. In the base game, there are 118 priest and druid spells, including HLAs. There are only 7 spell levels in the divine book, so that's an average of 17 per level. But once you take out the druid priest non-overlapping Venn diagram circles, right? The fact that not any character gets access to both druid and priest spells, and some spells that are only for good or evil casters. It's more like an average of 12 to 13 spells to choose from per level in the priest and druid books, and you only get 7 levels. Versus for arcane, there are 197 arcane spells in the base game, including HLAs. So that's more like an average of 20 spells per level. So like 1.5 to 2 times the selection or options, while also having fewer spell slots. So I guess in theory, that means that there's going to be some spells in the divine book here that are very situational, but still pretty decent because you have the spell slots to take the spells, and there's not like 10 other varieties of spell or a ton of other options at the level that mean that a spell gets kicked totally out of your spell book. All right, the last thing I'll touch on in a bit more detail before turning to the level 1 guide is the difference between druid and clerics. I already said that I'm going to focus only on clerics here, or the priest book, not the druid book. In the base game, there are 16 spells that cleric lacks that are in the druid book only and not in the cleric book. And of those, this guide is still going to give you a really good flavor for the divine book overall, because of the 16 spells that I'm not going to talk about, there's really only 3, the 3 I mentioned at the head, Insect Plague, Iron Skins, and Creeping Doom, that I would consider to be strong spells, clearly worth taking over options that are on the priest side. Even with SCS installed, SCS does do a good job of further differentiating between priests and clerics by adding an additional between clerics and druids by adding an additional 18 druid specific spells. But most of these are mediocre damage spells. Like the best one is probably Static Charge, which is like Call Lightning indoors. Beyond that, at level 4, you're getting a variety of just okay to crappy damage spells. So by talking about the priest book only here, I'm going to miss only a few spells that are really amazing. Whereas, on the druid side, the druid book is much more limited in terms of missing great spells that the priest side has. The druid side lacks from the base game 45 different spells that are in the priest book. So the druid book overall is much more limited. And then on top of those 45 spells that druid lacks, SCS adds another 13 additional spells that to the priest book, which I will be talking about, that the druid side lacks. And some of those SCS added spells that are priest only are very solid spells. Exaltation, Recitation, Divine Protection, we'll get to them. But, SCS sort of doubles down on the priest book being overall better than the druid book. And I think there's more spells that SCS adds for the priest side that are priest specific than druid specific spells that are solid. So SCS, it does even out the numbers of spells between druid and cleric, but the overall divine spellbook is still heavily biased towards the cleric in terms of, I think, overall strength and also number of spells. So I'm going to cover most of the divine book here, even though I'm only going to be talking about priests. All right, I'll make sure to put a timestamp. Brevity has never been a feature of these videos, so if you're looking for that, go elsewhere. I'm going for more for completeness, but I'll put a timestamp that skips people straight to the first level 1 spell, because I'm now going to start going through, after all that preface, which I won't repeat in later levels, I'm going to start going through the level 1 spells in the priest book and rating each of them and talking about what they do. And we have the best for first here. So the first, I'll go alphabetical order like usual. The first level 1 priest spell is Armor of Faith. Armor of Faith has a duration of 3 rounds plus 1 round per level, a cast time of 1, so quite quick, affects the caster only, and no saving throw because it's a buff. The caster of the Armor of Faith receives significant protection against melee and magical attacks. This magical armor is a force of energy that absorbs a portion of the damage intended for the caster. At first level, the protection is 5%, and every 5 levels of the caster improves this by another 5%. For example, a 20th level priest would have 25% of his damage absorbed if protected by this spell. All right, so this is one of the quintessential divine magic spells, I would say. We're already seeing how the divine book deviates from the arcane, because this is a strong defensive spell, level 1, that's more suited to a melee fighting tank style of most cleric builds. Armor of Faith, what is it? It's a damage resistance spell. So it's going to proportionately reduce damage taken by the casting cleric. The types of damage resisted are every damage type in the game, both magical and physical, which is a great thing about this spell. It's really cool. I think this is the only spell or ability in the entire game that applies both physical and magic/elemental damage type resistances all in one go. Specifically, the resistances you're going to pick up by casting this are to slashing, crushing, piercing, and missile damage, so all 4 types of physical damage. Plus, you're also going to get 5 to 25% fire, cold, electricity, and acid resistance, so that's all 4 of the elemental damage types, plus 25% resistance to magic damage. This is one of the very rare level 1 spells in the entire game that has such scaling that it's actually more likely to be cast once you hit high levels than when you first have access to level 1 spells. As a low-level cleric, you have few spell slots, and there's lots of level 1 spells that are more useful than the unscaled versions of this spell, which will have a super short duration and only provide 5% resistance, right? Because this starts at 5% damage resistance, and it also starts with a duration of only 3 rounds plus 1 round or 4 rounds right when you start the game at level 1. You need some time to scale into the full 25% resistance, and also the spell having some decent duration from scaling up to 3 rounds plus 1 per level, capping at level 20. Or that's a total of 23 rounds, which is a decent duration. It's probably an entire fight, or maybe a couple fights. The scaling of the resistance percentage works like this. At levels 1 to 4, you have 5% resistance. At levels 5 through 9, you have 10%. Levels 10 through 14, 15%. Levels 15 through 19, 20%. And then once you get to level 20 plus, you get the full 25% maximum resistance from this spell. Now, the thing to note about these resistance percentages and damage resistances generally is that a percent resistance is actually more powerful than you might think, just because of how the rounding works in this game. And I'm going to illustrate this by showing the exact math. The way that the rounding works is that if there's any damage resistance at all, then you're going to shave at least one point of damage off of whatever the amount of damage taken would otherwise have been. So for example, if you're hit for 50 points of damage, that's probably a bad example. If you're hit for 3 points of damage and you only have 5% resistance, you might think, well, it's just going to round down and you're not going to resist any of the damage. But the way that the game works is that as long as you have any resistance whatsoever, so even the 5% that you start with from Armor of Faith, the game is going to knock at least 1 point off of the damage you otherwise would have taken, so long as there's still at least 1 point of damage remaining. So if you get hit with 3 damage and you have 5% resistance on, that's going to reduce that to 2 damage. And so actually what you thought was a 5% resistance actually was resisting 33% of the damage in that instance. Where the rounding up breaks is where you get hit by a single point of damage, then the game is going to round that up so that you can't fully resist that 1 point of damage and you'll still take 1 point of damage. But obviously, taking 1 point of damage is not what you're really after with the spell. You want to reduce the big hits or the hits that are more typically sized for what you would get struck with in game. So just to illustrate how much the rounding up of the damage reduction actually helps, what I did here is I showed a range of pre-resistance damage taken from 1 to 50. So probably the average hit that you take in the game is somewhere between maybe 5 and 20 damage. Maybe higher if it's coming from a high level spellcaster and it's elemental damage, but probably most things are in that 5 to 20 range. But for here, I ran this all the way up to 50. This probably understates the strength of Armor of Faith and resistances, but I ran the pre-resistance hit all the way up to 50 points of damage, and then showed the impact of the rounding to show the actual percentage reduction in damage that you're creating by having Armor of Faith on at the different levels of resistances from 5, 10, 15, and 20, and then 25. And what this spreadsheet is showing is that the average resistance you pick up from the 5% level is actually 9.2% if you just straight average all the scenarios from 1 to 50 pre-reduction damage. If you just focus on the band that's most likely, maybe that 5 to 20 point band, then the average is actually, it's slightly higher, 9.4%. But I think this just goes to show that the rounding up leads to these resist percentages being unintuitively significantly higher than as advertised, right? A 5% sticker resistance like you have at the lowest level version of Armor of Faith will actually give you an average of 9.2% of resistance once the rounding is done. The 10% will give you an average of 13.4%. The 15% will give you an average of 18.2%. The 20% an average of 22.5%. And by the time you get to 25% damage resistance, you're getting like an extra 2 points of damage resistance on average if you have the 25% level on. So just something to note about resistances, they're always a little bit more powerful than you would suspect because of this rounding dynamic. The last thing I'll say about Armor of the Faith and why it is a strong spell is that this spell is really easy to stack with other sources of resistances to get you to complete immunity to damage or compound the power of your additive resistances. For example, fighter clerics can combine this with hardiness. This also combines with Defender of Easthaven to create 45% physical damage resistance right there. You can combine this with innate druid elemental resistances. You can combine this with elemental resistances from items, or you can stack this with a protection of the elements or protection from energy from the Arcane Book, which grants 75% immunity to magic and elemental to get to 100% immunity with just 2 spells and no items, 100% immunity to all elemental damage and magic damage. So because this is a level 1 spell and there's so many other sources of resistances, this is a good spell to stack with other sources of resistances. In terms of use cases, this is one of the best spells in the level 1 book. It's the only level 1 spell in the entire priest book that actually scales up meaningfully as you level. The only one. So already that means there's something to be said for it. And the effects that it's providing you are quite are quite strong, really, for a level 1 spell. Ironically or unintuitively, this spell is a level 1 spell that really doesn't come into its own until much later in the saga. You're going to have better spells out of the Divine Book that are more impactful early on than a 5% damage resistance or even a 10% damage resistance. You need to get this spell to a place where it has some real duration and you're up into the 15 to 25% resistance brackets. So like BG2 and TOB before it really starts to shine. So it's a spell that kind of lurks there, gathering power, and then suddenly becomes by far the best level 1 priest spell for most of the saga. And overall, I would say this level 1 spell is doing more than any other level 1 spell in the game from Arcane or Divine Book. Once you get into higher levels, there's nothing that's more relevant or powerful to you by the time you get to BG2 and TOB than adding damage resistance. And you're getting 25 points of it here from a spell that you're going to have plenty of slots for, and you could have cast from the very beginning of the game, but it took some time to scale into real utility. So in terms of a rating, this is not a game-breaking spell or some high-level mechanic that's new to your spell book, but it's as good as you can expect any level 1 spell to be, and I'll give it a 9 out of 10 rating. The one knock you could make against it is the duration, which maxes at 23 rounds, and the fact that it's not relevant in the very beginning of the saga. But once you do get into the longer durations and the 20% plus resistances, this spell is something that if I have nothing better to do, either walking around a dungeon or heading into a fight, then I'm casting this spell repeatedly on all my divine casters because it never hurts to have an extra damage resistance up. Overall, a very high quality spell, the best level 1 spell in the Arcane or Divine Book, and 9 out of 10 rating for Armor of Faith. Second spell alphabetically in the Priest Book is Bless. Bless can be cast from a range of 40 feet. It has a duration of 6 rounds, fixed, a cast time of 9. The AoE is a 15-foot radius. No save given it's a buff. Upon uttering the Bless spell, the caster raises the morale of friendly creatures by +1. Furthermore, it raises their attack and damage rolls by +1. The caster determines at what range up to 40 feet the spell will be cast. At the instant the spell is completed, it affects all creatures in a 15-foot radius centered on the point selected by the caster. Thus, affected creatures leaving the area are still subject to the spell's effects. Those entering the area after the casting is completed are not. That last parenthetical there is a lot of words to just say that this works like any other AoE one-time, like non-repeating AoE spell in the game. Yes, the creatures have to be in the AoE at the time the AoE goes off for it to be affected. All right, what is this spell? So a quintessential function of the priest or divine caster in D&D and in Baldur's Gate as well is to buff the party. And here's the first baby buff spell that you get at level 1 that you can use to improve the stats of your whole party for a fight. Unfortunately, as we'll see, this is hardly even a baby of a spell. It's more like a zygote or an embryo buff. What do you get out of it? So first, notice the extremely long cast time of 9 and the very short non-scaling spell duration of 6 rounds. That is a horrible dynamic. You're getting a spell that's only going to be up, or a buff that's only going to be up for a duration that's like 7 times as long as it takes to actually cast the spell. A cast time of 9 is just ages, when in the alternative you could be moving your priest around to avoid damage. You could be getting off 1 to 2 auto attacks. A cast time of 9 is just brutal, especially out of the Divine Book, where you're never going to have a chance to shorten that up with items realistically. So it's just a really bad dynamic to have such a short duration of 6 rounds on a cast time 9 spell. For a spell like that to ever be worthwhile, the buff that you get would have to be very powerful. So what do you get? Oh, the sole impact is you get a +1 bonus to your attack rolls. So that's a d20 concept, right? You're rolling d20s to see if you can hit. You get a +1 bonus to damage, and you get a +1 bonus to morale. I'll get back to morale in a second. I haven't talked about that game mechanic at all, so I'm going to go into it in a little bit of detail just because this is the first time it comes up. But for now, suffice to say that morale and morale boosting by 1 is pretty much irrelevant. So what you're really getting is a +1 bonus to damage and Thaco. And a +1 bonus to Thaco and damage is going to do almost nothing at any point in the game. It's like the most minor type of buff that you could imagine. +1 saves would be more useful because with saves, you have limited sources to reduce your saving throws, and you can get to a place where you're on the cusp of having 100% likelihood for your party to make save if you have a saving throw of 2 post buffs. So like there would be some case to maybe use this if it at least boosted saves, which is the other D20 concept in the game that comes to mind, but it doesn't even do that. It only touches, I think, the weakest D20 concept, which is your rolls to hit physical attacks, and then you get this +1 bonus to damage. When you start out the game right out of Candlekeep, your problem is not that you don't have enough damage or that like +1 damage is going to make a difference. Your problem is that your Thacos across your whole party are horrible. You know, BG1 very early on, it looks like Rock'em Sock'em fighters, like those little plastic figurines that you just spam the punch button and they keep whiffing on each other. That's what your fights look like right when you get out of Candlekeep. You do not have a problem of missing 1 damage per hit. You have a problem that you're missing all your attack rolls by like 5, 10, 7. You know, your starting priest Thacos are going to be just under 20, like 18 or 19. You're going to have a lot of arcane casters in your party that have 18 or 19 Thacos. Fighter starting Thacos are still in the teens. So right when you start, a +1 boost to your Thaco is just not going to make a difference. You're still going to be whiffing a lot of your auto attacks. And so even at the part in the game when like a marginal benefit could arguably be worth taking up a cast time of 9, this buff is not going to do anything for you. And we'll get to command later on. Actually, it's the very next spell. But this dynamic of your Thacos not even being in the realm of close enough to make your auto attacks hit when you're very, very early in the saga. That's why command, which stuns enemies and makes your hits guaranteed hits without needing to roll, is such a better spell than the bless spell. I mean, would you rather change your chance to hit for your whole party to 100%? Or increase the chance to hit by, in most instances, 5% by giving yourself a +1 bonus to your attack roll? So the answer is obvious. So giving up, even early on when in theory there should be some room to take up your action for such a minor buff, giving up a level 1 slot for a bless spell when you could take command makes no sense if you're trying to boost your auto attacks. Later on in the saga, clearly a +1 Thaco and a +1 damage bonus are never going to be worth giving up your action and a cast time of 9. And again, this is just an example of the difference between the arcane and the divine books. Because in the arcane book, there's a lot of minor buffs that because they stack and there's 0 cast time with Vecna and you have Alacrity, it may be worth keeping one of those spells just to chuck out the buff. It costs you almost nothing and it's going to stack with all the other benefits to your party. This spell would have a hard time competing even there because of the extreme cast time. But on a divine caster, when you don't have the availability of Alacrity and you can't reduce that cast time of 9, a spell that has a cast time like this and such a minor effect is just DOA. You're never going to want to take it. So before coming off the Bless spell, I will go back to morale and just talk about morale for a minute because it's a game dynamic that I haven't talked about yet in any of these guides. The way that morale works is that it's a stored variable for all NPCs in your party. It never affects custom created characters, and it never affects the main character. So this is just a game dynamic that applies to NPCs that you pick up and add to your party that are pre-generated in the game. You know, all the characters that you can bring along with you through your adventures in Baldur's Gate. Every NPC in the game starts with a their morale set at 10, and then that number will automatically regenerate 1 morale point up to the starting value of 10 every 4 seconds. So already we can see that Bless, even when it comes to morale, is pretty useless, even if morale mattered, because Bless is only giving you +1 morale, and you'd achieve that anyway in 4 seconds of in-game time. So the +1 morale boost that Bless is giving, morale regenerates at a rate of 1 per 4 seconds of game time. I should say in real life time. It's 4 seconds of in real life time. That's hardly any time. So the Bless boost is almost irrelevant, even if morale mattered. Now, different NPCs have different morale levels at which they will become feared or berserk and drop from your control and go yellow circle, until enough time passes for them to regenerate morale back above their break level. So, quote-unquote brave NPCs like Ajantis might have a break value of 2, so that's pretty far off from 10, the starting point. And Frady or weak-willed NPCs like Khalid have a break value of 6. The things that reduce morale are a party member dying, dropping below 50% HP on the affected character, and dropping below 25% HP on the affected character. Each of these things causes a morale loss of 2. So for a Frady character like Khalid, you can definitely see a morale failure if something not too uncommon happens in battle, like if Khalid gets reduced below 25 HP in rapid succession from him getting reduced below 50, that's going to be a morale loss of 4, and he's going to go from a morale of 10 to 6, and he's going to have morale failure. Or, for example, Khalid could witness somebody else in the party die and have his hit points reduced below 50, and that's going to be enough for morale failure. Practically speaking, in my experience playing the game, it seems like, number one, this hardly ever happens. It seems like and I could spend a lot of time testing this, but it's just almost irrelevant. So I'm going to wave the white flag here. This is one of the things I'm not going to test out. I didn't go that way with rest healing. You'll see that when I get to it later. But I really tested rest healing and figured out everything about how it works. But on morale, I'm going to wave the white flag. Practically speaking, it seems like there's some hidden variables that make morale break less likely less likely to happen than the simple math that I just went through would indicate. And in particular, in my experience, it seems like at higher levels, once the entire party is quite leveled, that morale failure hardly ever occurs, even when party members are dying. Maybe it's just that there's buffs like remove fear, or maybe chaotic commands has some unstated effect on it. Maybe it's the effect of buffs. Maybe it's just that high-level characters tend to have adjustments to their morale that aren't described in what I just went through. But I hardly ever see morale breaks occurring, except for maybe if a fight's going wrong very early in the saga. I don't play party play a lot though, so maybe you do actually see morale breaks in your runs. Definitely comment. Like if you've ever seen a morale failure, or whether it's the fear version or the berserk version, occur on a high level party member in a BG2 or TOB fight, definitely let me know. I've never seen it watching a lot of stream content or in my own games. So it seems like morale is even less relevant than even the straight math would suggest. For present purposes, I think all that's needed to understand is that there are much better ways to avoid morale failure than the Bless spell. For example, Remove Fear, also a level 1 priest spell, will make you completely immune to morale failure entirely for 1 hour. And this spell, Bless, will only give you a +1 bonus to morale for 6 rounds. The odds that Bless is ever going to be the difference between morale failure or not are basically nil because of the very minor +1 bonus and the fact that Bless only lasts for 6 rounds to begin with. So, in sum, to wrap up the discussion of Bless here, I can't say this is one of the worst spells in the game because it is a level 1 spell, and level 1 spells are sometimes weak and not worth using and don't scale. But Bless is pretty trash, and you're way better off taking Command to help you fight early on. Later on, you'll have much more powerful spells and auto attacks and never want to give up a cast time of 9 to get this tiny buff. So there's basically no place for this spell in the game, even though it's not particularly horrible considering it's a level 1. I will rate Bless a 2 out of 10 spell. Next up, Command. Command is a spell with a 90-foot cast range, a duration of 1 round, a cast time of 1, so very fast, AoE 1 creature, saving throw special. This spell enables the priest to command another creature to die or sleep for a single round. At the end of the round, the creature awakens and is unharmed. Creatures with 6 or more hit dice or experience levels are entitled to a saving throw versus spell to ignore the command. Okay, here is a spell that I never really paid attention to when I was first playing the game as a teen on our Win95 Gateway PC with the multi-disc pack that came gratis with the PC and our dial-up modem and all that good stuff. At that stage, from my vague memory, long ago, sleep effects actually did not stun enemies. They merely caused the enemy to go to sleep, and then as soon as you hit that enemy with an auto attack, it would wake the enemy up. But that's not the way that sleep works in Enhanced Edition or any recent patch of BG or BG2, including with SCS. A sleep effect is now the same as a stun. So that hugely increased the value of this spell. Bigger picture, I probably just looked at this and thought it only affects 1 enemy creature and it doesn't do damage, so I'm not going to bother to stock this. But I was definitely missing out because this is a very useful spell. Very early on in the saga, it is a spell that can help you avoid dying and get you through some encounters with minor enemies before you've been able to level, or help you get some critical items or critical XP early on, and do so in a way that doesn't risk losing your run because you're fighting with 10 to 20 HP. So what does this spell do? It knocks 1 target creature unconscious for 1 round. This will only work on creatures that are susceptible to sleep spells, so that means the main distinction there is that it does not work on undead. But it will work on all humanoids, and it'll work on pretty much all monsters you'll meet in early BG1, like kobolds, ankegs, hobgoblins, etc. The effect of the spell is that the enemy creature hits the deck and can't attack you, and on top of that, they're treated as stunned by the game, which means that while a creature is stunned, every attack hits, regardless what the to-hit roll would have been. So this spell is getting you 2 super helpful things early on. First of all, you're not going to get attacked by the creature it was cast on. And second, you can also hit enemies while they're down despite your horrible starting THAC0. The optimal strategy with this spell is to get everyone in your party that can melee at all, so like can wear a helmet or armor, get them all dual wielding, since the penalties of THAC0 from dual wielding won't matter. Only the number of attacks per round will matter if you're fighting a sleeped or stunned creature through command. Then you hit 1 enemy with this spell and you focus your entire party's fire on it. Pretty much everything in early BG1 is going to die in a single round of getting hit 100% of the attacks coming its way. And what I do a lot in my solo runs, if you watch the video that I did on how I start runs, I played that through with a cleric mage. And what I generally do a lot in solo runs is that very early on, I'll stock a bunch of commands and then I'll hit the enemy with a command. Because of the cast time of 1 and the long range, you can always get enemies on the deck before they can get an attack against you. Then I'll immediately switch to dual wielding, and my Thacker will be something atrocious like 20 or 20 and 24, but it doesn't matter. And I'll go up, get 2 auto attacks off with the guaranteed hit. And then if you start casting command again after you get your 2 auto attacks off, that's just enough time with the very fast cast time of 1 to put the enemy back to sleep before they've had a chance to even get up and get an attack off against you. So you can chain these command spells to kill enemies that are much tougher than you and would normally kill you early on in the saga. Instead, you're having all your attacks hit, and they can never attack you if you time this right. And because of the no save for enemies with 6 or fewer levels, there's some enemies that are pretty beefy that this will work on guaranteed. Ankegs are probably the top example of an enemy that has a scary auto attack with acid damage. Their crits hit really hard, and they have ranged attacks, and they also have, I don't know, something like 40 HP or something like that. That is not an enemy you could dream of fighting early on in the saga without having access to this spell. This spell turns the tables, and now you might have to chain 3 or 4 of them together if you're soloing, but with command, you can now fight that Ankeg and do so with very little risk. So taking out the RNG, getting your horrible Thaco attacks to hit, and protecting you from enemy attacks is all amazing stuff early on. If there's a criticism of the command spell, it's definitely that this thing gets obsoleted hard once you get to even mid to end BG1 and you start facing enemies that are all level 6 or above. With a save versus spell, enemies will save most of the time, and if you waste your spell casting round in combat on a spell with a save just for a spell to negate, you want at least the spell you're casting to probably be something much nastier than a 1-round stun. Like at that point, you may as well be trying for a hold person, or if it's a mage, you could be trying for a silence before all mages start getting access to vocalize, like mid BG1. But the point is, once you get to the point where enemies start being able to save versus this, and you have access to much more powerful stun spells, you're pretty much never going to use command again. What usually happens in my runs is that this is my top cast cleric spell for like levels 1 through 5. And then past that point, I'm pretty much never casting it ever. And I'm instead taking protection from evil, sanctuary, and maybe some cure light wounds in level 1 before Armor of the Faith really starts getting going. In terms of rating, this is a strange spell. It's one that is super helpful and powerful only in the very, very beginning of the game. And then by the time you get leveled at all, like once you've gone through Mutiman's Garden, once you're through mid BG1 or even late BG1, certainly the spell is completely gone, and then it's not going to come back into your spell book ever again. So how do I rate that? I can't go for a 6 or higher rating on a whole saga rating system here for a spell that's irrelevant by even maybe mid, but definitely end BG1. This is definitely a strong spell though right at the beginning, and for that I'll go with a 5 out of 10. That's on my rating scale, a decent spell that has limited uses through at least part of the saga. In actuality, this is more like a super strong spell that has extremely limited or that has okay uses, but through a extremely limited part of the saga. It's like your playtime in levels 1 through 5, if you're playing optimally in BG1, is like, I don't know, you're facing like 20 enemies before you're pretty leveled. So yeah, the use cases are limited because this thing gets obsoleted so hard, but it does greatly assist you with getting through the very, very early stages of the game and not dying. So I'll go with a 5 out of 10 spell for command. On like a BG1 only rating level, this would be like a 7 or 8 out of 10 or something, but we're talking about whole saga here, and this spell has no scalability past early BG1. Next up, Cure Light Wounds. I will say, so many of these spells there's some spells that are so familiar from playing this game for so many years, but especially when I was younger and just picking up the game out of the box. There's certain spells that because you see enemies cast them or because your kid brain is just attracted to how they work, you just always stocked them, or at least I did, and it feels like they're like the classic spells. It's like Magic Missile, Fireball, Cure Light Wounds is definitely one of those. Just the icon and the cast animation, it all just screams nostalgia for me. So I'm not, that's not a part of this rating system, but when I come across spells like that, I do want to note it. Like, what's more classic than a cleric casting Cure Light Wounds in early BG1? Just awesome. I don't know. I love this game. So Cure Light Wounds, one of those classic spells. It has a range of touch, duration permanent, I guess in the sense that the hit points you add never go away until the person's attacked again, but sure. Area of effect 1 creature, cast time of 5, no saving throw. By casting this spell and laying his hand upon a creature, the priest causes 8 points of wound or other injury damage to the creature's body to be healed. This healing cannot affect creatures without corporeal bodies, nor can it cure wounds of creatures not living or of extraplanar origin. That's not true. You can heal up a skeleton with this thing. So I don't know what that means. Curing is permanent only insofar as the creature does not sustain further damage. Caused wounds will heal or can be cured just as any normal injury. That's just gobbledygook too. I don't really know what that means. In any event. Okay, so clearly one of the roles of divine casters is to heal the party. For reasons I'll get into though, that used to be a lot more important of a game mechanic prior to BG2, TOB, and the current version of the Enhanced Edition. And I'll get into that. It has a lot to do with rest dynamics. And I will go into rest dynamics in detail because one of the main reasons that you used to want to have a lot of divine casters in your party and stock a lot of heal spells was the way that resting used to work before the EE, or I don't even know if it came in, if rest until healed came in the Beamdog versions. I'm not sure. But the point is, in the original release of Baldur's Gate, heal spells were a lot more useful from an ease of use perspective than they are today, and I will get into why that is. But in any event, here we are with the first ever healing spell at level 1, Cure Light Wounds. It's got a cast time of 5, and like all the other single target heal spells in the game, you need to be in melee range at the start of casting. So you can get your priest close to the target that you're healing if you're trying to heal in combat or something, and then the targeted character can run away after the cast animation appears and still get healed. So that's worth noting. You can run your fighter around as long as you run them close to the casting priest at the time the cast time of 5 starts. The heal will still go off. Now, I seem to remember that this spell used to have RNG or be a die roll to determine how many points were healed. That probably is derived from D&D or how heal spells work in D&D. But now the spell just does 8 points of healing no matter what. And I think that's probably smart because, like, if you had to roll a D8, then that wouldn't be very fun, right? You think you're going to save a character in your party by healing them in combat, and you start casting this, you get it off, but you only heal them for 1 point and they die anyway. That doesn't seem very fun. So this seems like the right approach. It's just 8 points every time. How good is this? Well, I'm not going to come back to this subject every time, or at least in detail, every time I talk about a heal spell, but there's a consistent problem with healing spells regardless the level. And that is that they compare really disfavorably to potions in almost every scenario. So first of all, casting a heal spell, if you're doing it in combat, right? Out of combat, whatever. If you hate using potions and you want to spend all your time standing in the forest, listening to the beautiful music and the birds tweeting, just having your casters cast Cure Light Wounds on your whole party to heal them to full instead of resting, and that's how you like to play the game. Okay, great. Like, that's fantastic. No issues there. That's not really power gaming or whatever. That's not part of this guide. That's lovely. But the place where the merits of the spell actually matters or doesn't matter is when it comes to combat and what's the most effective way to keep your party safe and high HP. And when it comes to in combat healing, potions are just going to do better than almost every heal spell. There's exceptions when you start to get to the very high level heal spells in the Divine Book, like Heal with the capital H, that will heal one character to full and remove a bunch of status effects. But for every other heal spell, maybe it's going to get close versus a potion when we get to some of the, level 4, level 5 spells. But down here at level 1, like, just use this as an example. You have access to your basic blue potion of healing. There's tons of them in the game. That potion is going to give you 9 points of healing, guaranteed. So that potion is 1 more point than Cure Light Wounds. You can use it instantly, which is massive. A cast time of 5 is a long time when you need healing. When you need healing, you need it now, and you can't wait for another auto attack or range attack to come in and potentially kill the creature that you're trying to heal. The potion solves that. The other thing about the potion is that potions take up actions on the character that's being healed, not on your spellcasters, which is huge, because when you're in a battle, the tanky characters, the ones that need the most healing and are on your front lines, tend to be the ones that, especially early on in the saga and through a lot of BG2, like before HLAs, they don't really have much to do with their actions. They probably can't use wands, and they may not have access to any spells at all, and they don't have access to HLAs like Crit Strike, etc. Once HLAs come into the picture, only then does the actions of a fighter really start to matter more than an action of a spellcaster, arguably. But even then, your spellcasters at that time are going to have amazing offensive spells that they're not going to want to give up a round casting a heal and miss out on one of those offensive spells. So the point is, taking up an action on a tank is much lower opportunity cost than taking an action on your divine caster, which could be casting a command, it could be casting a different buff, it could be casting a different offensive spell. So the point is that it's much better to use potions because a potion will take an action on your tank instead of on a spellcaster. So potions, they're the blue potion of healing to compare against this spell. It's going to heal for an extra point. It's going to not take any time. It's instant cast. And also it can be cast on a character that doesn't have other spells to cast. So the blue potion, of which there are tons in the game, is just much better than the spell in almost every scenario. Unless you're like out of combat and you're trying to conserve resources, that potion is always going to be better. And just to preview, like potions, accessible potions do scale pretty hard, and they continue to compete very strongly with any of the healing spells in the game. You have elixirs of health in BG1 as well. There's a lot of those in temples and that are lootable. That's going to get you a full 10 points of healing, and it cures disease/poison. Once you get into BG2, you very quickly have access to a ton of potions of extra healing. Like, this is like the number 1 dropped item in the initial Orenicus dungeon. They're for sale everywhere. You can have unlimited potions of extra healing. I end up with like hundreds or dozens of extra of these, and I use a lot of them in my runs. There's tons of those lying around all over the place, and they heal 27 points of damage immediately. And then when you get to TOB, of course, you have the potion of superior healing. That can be created unlimitedly from many of the alchemy/create potions abilities. There's lots of them in Watcher's Keep that are lootable. You can buy them from stores, and that restores 40 hit points instantly. So a theme of the heal spells is that you never want to cast a heal spell when you have access to a potion. And you'll have access to a lot of potions, and the potions do scale pretty well as you go through the saga. All right, that's enough with me dumping on heal spells. I'm going to now get to the other reason that you would care about this spell, which is the rest dynamic. So, like, I already sort of covered that you don't want cure light wounds if you're in a tight spot during a battle. For that, you would prefer the blue potion if you have one and you're going to have a lot of them. What about outside of battle? Is there any scenario where it's helpful to have access to healing spells, and in particular cure light wounds, when you're not in battle? Well, that's the scenario of resting. And here I'm going to talk in a bit of detail about the rest mechanics and dynamics in the game. Okay, so I guess first I'll talk about how rest healing works. You click rest, you'll always get this message that says healing spells cast on rest until fully healed. What that is reflecting in the game is that when you hit the rest button, even if your rest is immediately interrupted by a soldier, like those annoying soldiers that tell you can't sleep on the street. By the way, like Amn and Ethkaya, I can't even say the name of the city in BG2. That was a horrible choice. Why did the A city and Baldur's Gate city and Nashkel, like these are some of the most anti-homos jurisdictions in the universe. The diligence with which these damn goose-stepping soldiers will prevent you from sleeping on the streets is crazy. So if you get interrupted because you're trying to sleep in one of those places by a soldier, or you get interrupted in the wild by some spawning enemies, even if you get immediately interrupted, when you hit the rest button, even if your rest is interrupted, the game is going to instantly dump your entire spellbook of healing spells and use them to heal your party to full, if the spells are memorized when you click the rest button. So you can still heal to full even if you get interrupted if you click the rest button when you have a lot of heal spells memorized and not, grayed out because you've used them already on your party. You're still going to heal a lot when you click that button. All right. After the game dumps your memorized spells when you hit the rest button for the first time, if your rest hasn't been interrupted and you're allowed to rest where you're standing or you're at an inn, then the game will run the rest code and have you rest for 8 hours, right? So that's 1 night of rest. Okay. Now there's a big fork in the road as to what the game does, okay? So far, the game has dumped your still memorized heal spells when you clicked rest, and then it's allowed you to rest for 8 hours. Now there's a fork in the road. Depending on whether you have the option rest until healed clicked in the gameplay options. Now this toggle did not used to be available in the game. The option to rest until healed. You used to only be able to rest 8 hours at a time. And when you do that, if you rest 8 hours at a time, the only way that you're going to heal, you get some small amount of HP pickup for every 8 hours of rest. If you're resting in an inn, you get 1 to 4 HP per character, depending on whether you rested with the peasant through the royal room. But if you are in old BG and you don't have rest until heal clicked, then the only way you're really going to heal your party is through the memorized heal spells that you have, because you're only picking up 1 to 4 hit points per rest, even if you're in an inn, and there's no mechanic that gets your hit points back other than dumping the memorized spells. So the way to heal a ton of damage in old school BG without the rest until heal clicked is that you need to have a bunch of heal spells memorized. In fact, I remember doing this as a kid playing the game to rest up my whole party if we were all very damaged. You would dump out your cleric spell slots and stuff them with a bunch of heal spells, because what you would then do is you'd go to the inn and rest, or you'd hit rest, and the first time you rested, you would hardly regain any HP, but you'd regain all your spells. Okay, now you have a ton of heal spells memorized. Now you rest again, and the game is going to dump the heal spells, and it's going to heal your whole party to full. right? Because you just dumped out all your memorized heal spells. So you can rest 2 times and get your whole party back to full pretty much every time through doing that mechanic in the old game. That's what you have to do without the rest until heal button or dynamic. Basically, the game was like sort of user friendly. It was allowing you to save all of the clicks of needing to manually empty out your spell book to heal yourself with memorized heal spells, but it wasn't giving you any healing beyond the healing that you get from the 1 to 4 hit points from resting in an inn per character per 8 hours, plus then whatever the hit points that would be healed from all of your heal spells. So in old school BG, without rest until healed, heal spells were actually a lot more useful for ease of use. If you kept some amount of them memorized on your divine casters, then every time you hit sleep, you were going to regain a lot more HP more quickly. You were going to spend less time clicking the rest button repeatedly. And if you kept some of them memorized, even if you never used them in combat, if you kept some of them memorized, then you weren't going to have to do this game of emptying out your spell book from all your offensive spells, putting in a bunch of heals, and then using that to heal up your party to full. All right, that's old school. That's like the hard way of playing Baldur's Gate. All right, we're now in 2025. We have TikTok. We have all this other shit, and we also have rest until healed. Okay, what does rest until healed do? So this is a toggle that's in the gameplay settings for BG. I definitely have it clicked on. Why would you not? It makes the game a lot easier, it's much easier to play if you're trying to heal up your whole party. Okay, the major difference between no rest until healed and rest until healed. If you have rest until healed clicked, then if you're still injured after the initial dump of memorized and unused healing spells plus 8 hours of rest, then if you have no healing spells at that point after 8 hours of rest, or if your healing spells are not sufficient to heal the entire party to full, then what seems to happen with rest until heal clicked is that the game is going to put you down for another 8 hours. So it's going to say you rested for 16 hours. It's going to see that you're still injured after an 8-hour rest, and it's going to rest you again for 8 hours. So it's a total of 16 hours. And if you get a 16-hour rest through rest until healed, your whole party is going to be mega healed to full, regardless what healing spells you have memorized or not. So the game, there's some force code that the developers put into the game that if you click rest until healed, the game's just going to put you down for 16 hours, and it's going to treat you as though you did dump out your divine spell books, put them all with healing spells. Those were all used after 8 hours in the middle of the night. And when you clicked the second rest, and then you wake up after 16 hours. Although you didn't have to do all that. You don't even have to stock a single heal spell to get the benefit of the mega heal that you get through rest until healed. Okay, so the point is that with rest until healed clicked, you get this mega heal with 16 hours of sleep, regardless whether you memorized healing spells. So the bottom line is that in the current state of Baldur's Gate and Baldur's Gate 2, as soon as this rest and heal until healed dynamic was put into the game, the utility of all the healing spells for ease of use, for practical gameplay, just fell off entirely, right? You don't even have a use for these spells to heal your party through resting, because you can just check rest until healed, rest for 16 hours, and even if you don't have a single heal spell memorized anywhere in your entire party, the game's going to pretend like you do, regardless whether you have divine casters or not, and it's going to give you the benefit of this mega heal. Okay, so like the old school thinking of I better have some heal spells so that I can quickly heal when I rest just goes out the window. All right, that's the impact for Cure Light Wounds and every other heal spell in the game. Now, I'm going to just take a little digression, like skip over this if you're not into real fringe scenario nerd shit in Baldur's Gate, but I'm going to go into a little digression as to how rest until healed interacts with regeneration and being cursed, and how rest until heal works when you have some of these status effects on your party, just because it's interesting. And I've made mistakes before where I've like lost time-based objectives in Baldur's Gate because of this rest until healed mechanic. So with rest until healed checked, it's generally not possible to rest for more than 16 hours. Because even if you have insufficient heal spells or none at all, the game will force your entire party to full health after the second rest of 8 hours, and then wake you up and say that you've rested for 16 hours. Okay, now, there's one exception, only one exception that I've found to this, which is that if you have a character that's affected by a curse effect, like from the Clay Golem, that prevents, and the curse effect prevents all healing, then the curse effect will block not only the dump of healing spells for that cursed character, but also it will block the forced heal to full after you've been sleeping for 8 hours that would normally take you to a total of 16 hours of rest through the magical rest until healed function. So the result is that if you go and click rest while a member of your party is cursed and you have rest until healed on, the game gets stuck, and because the super heal that goes off in the second 8 hours of sleep with rest until healed checked does not actually heal you into full, the game will keep trying to make you rest and trying to force heal you to full because it detects that you're not healed to full. And the outcome is that if you have a cursed character in your party and you have rest and heal until healed checked, you can actually rest for a maximum of 16 days and 16 hours straight from one click of the rest button. That's where the game will recognize that it's in a loop and force you out of your slumber, like extended cryo sleep or something, and then finally wake you up after 16 days and 16 hours. So this is total trivia or a complete side story, but basically I've definitely lost like the Thieves Guild or other time-based objectives in the game because I wanted to rest to take a curse off, so I stocked remove curse in my spell book, and then I hit the rest button. But because I play with rest until heal clicked, which is the much easier way to play, the game forced me into a 16-day and 16-hour sleep, and I blew through all the time-based objectives. Now, what's even worse is that if you are cursed and you have an item that gives you passive regeneration, then you can actually be in your slumber from clicking the rest button once for even longer than 16 days and 16 hours. Because I think the game will give you a few points of the passive regen, which is not blocked by like the Clay Golem curse spell. Passive regen is not blocked by that, just heal spells are. So the game will give you a few points of passive regen every time it puts you down to bed for another 8 hours. And as a result, the game logic must think that you're actually successfully healing. So it'll let you keep resting and resting and resting, and it won't cut you off at the max of 16 days and 16 hours. So if you are cursed and you have an item that gives you passive regen, which has happened to me before in the game, in that circumstance, if you click the rest until healed button, you can be in slumber for a really, really long time. With Ring of Gax, the duration to heal about 120 hit points was 31 days straight of sleep, because I would pick up a few hit points from the passive regen while cursed and then go back to sleep for another 8 hours. So I was actually able to rest for 31 days. If you have an item that gives even lower passive, even an even lower rate of passive regen than the Ring of Gax, which is pretty quick, then maybe in theory you could be asleep for like 2 months from one click of the rest button. Okay. This is all really dumb. This is total trivia. This only comes up in very niche situations where you're cursed. This has happened to me before, though. I've blown through time-based objectives and accidentally rested for many weeks at a time, and now I know why. I just had to uncheck rest until healed, because if you go to sleep when cursed and you have rest until healed clicked, you're going to end up resting for way too long. All right, digression over. I think the thing, and let's get back to Cure Light Wounds and heal spells out of the priest book. So I think the thing that is important to take away here is that heal spells in general are going to be hard to take because potions are faster. They don't have a cast time. They don't require any of your party to be anywhere physically on the battlefield. And potions take the action of a non-spellcaster so that your priest can cast more useful spells during battle. So in battle, a potion is better than a heal spell, generally speaking. Now out of battle, there used to be, in the old versions of BG, this out of battle ease of use reason to take a lot of heal spells, which is that you would only ever heal as much overnight as you had memorized heal spells when you click the rest button. With the introduction of rest until healed in the newer versions of Baldur's Gate, that reason to take heal spells out of combat to conveniently heal when you rest is now gone, because rest until healed, unless you're golem cursed, will force heal you to full after 16 hours of rest on your entire party. So what are we left with? I'm not going to repeat this whole thing on every heal spell in the whole priest book. I'm just going to say see level 1. But what are we left with? Well, there's really not much of a reason to take most of the heal spells in the priest book at all in this new world of Baldur's Gate. It's kind of counterintuitive, but with this rest until healed dynamic, usually a heal spell is going to be a waste of a slot. Unless you somehow are very low gold, you don't have enough potions, that sort of thing, and you're forced to use spell casting to heal. And returning to Cure Light Wounds in particular, it's a classic spell. It's a quintessentially divine spell, but from a power gaming perspective, it's not a spell that you're going to use all that much. Even very early in the game, there's plenty of blue potions available that are going to heal for more points of healing, and they're going to do it instantly and not require a spell slot. You might take a couple of these very early on if you have nothing better and you're low gold, low potions, but the odds you're ever going to save someone in an emergency situation with this spell, with its long cast time of 5 and still only healing 8 hit points is pretty low. You're probably better off running away, or you would use the ball spawn power version of this spell, which has a much faster cast time of 0 or 1. So overall, Cure Light Wounds, it's not a horrible spell. It's not all that fancy, obviously. There's just no scalability to it, and it's not even the best solution in the game when you're at level 1 for what it does. Instead, you use your blue potions if you're really in a pinch, and if you need to heal to full from taking a lot of damage while you're resting, you just check rest until healed and you'll be good. So I'll give Cure Light Wounds a 3 out of 10 rating. This would have been much higher from like a practicality or ease of use perspective if we were in the old regime where you only ever healed as many hit points while resting as you had heal spells. Then this spell would have been much more important. But as it stands, there's not much place for it left in your runs, and I hardly ever take the spell. 3 out of 10 rating. Okay, Detect Evil is the next spell. This is, by the way, all of these divine spells have a sphere that they're from, and as far as I can tell, there may be some relationship between this and the spell school that the spell is traded to be from for the purpose of the mage spell immunity. But beyond that, these spheres don't have any significance. It's not like, obviously, there's not like specialist priests. In any event, Detect Evil is from the Divination Sphere. It has an instant duration, a cast time of 2, AoE 30-foot radius, no saving throw. This spell discovers emanations of evil from any creature. Any evil creature within the range of the spell will glow red briefly. Okay, more of a role-playing spell. The spell is exactly the same as the version in the Arcane book with the same title of Detect Evil, although that's an Arcane level 2. This is Divine level 1. It does make sense, I guess, that Divine casters would be able to perceive evil more easily, so they get the spell earlier in the spell book. To recap here what I said about the Arcane version at level 2, is this one of the worst spells in the entire game? No, even though it seems like a role-playing spell, and it is largely, it still has some practical use cases. Given how the game works, generally, evil characters you can kill without minus rep. Rep is expensive. You have to pay to buy it back up. And if you don't, all of your purchasing at stores is going to cost more. So sometimes there could be some rare use case where you want to cast a spell to find out if you can murder somebody and take their gear and XP without a minus rep. And that's at least some use case. There's also very limited quests in both BG and BG2 where it helps to know if a character's evil. Like the example I can think of is in Baldur's Gate. There's that house in the northwest of the city where there's the two little girls that are complaining about the boogeyman coming at night. And there's two characters that walk into the house, and you could use the spell to detect that the male mage is evil. Generally, this spell and no alignment are the only way to find out for sure if someone is evil alignment. And this spell can be resisted by magic resistance. If that's ever relevant, I don't think it really is. At least there's no save and it's AoE. So it's pretty simple at the end of the day. There's very limited use case for this spell. There's not a combat use case, but I guess you can say that this is overall the best spell in the whole game for determining if another creature is evil alignment. So that is something. And it's a level 1 spell, so what do you expect? There's going to be stuff in here that's very marginal. It's still not a very useful spell at all from a power gaming perspective. You could go many, many runs of this game without ever stocking or casting this spell ever. I will give Detect Evil a 2 out of 10 rating. Next spell, Doom. Doom has a castable range of 25 feet, a duration of 1 turn or 10 rounds, a cast time of the max possible in the game, 9. AoE is 1 creature. This spell causes a feeling of doom to overwhelm the target. For the duration of the spell, the target receives a -2 penalty to all his rolls, including THAC0 and saving throws. There is no saving throw for this spell. All right, so this spell, Doom, I think is going to be the only one of the level 1 priest spells where I would call my take controversial or potentially controversial. I think this is a bad spell, and I'm going to get into why. I have seen in many spell guides Doom called a quality spell. I will say I don't use this spell on my runs. I find its effects to be highly marginal. I'm going to put that into numbers when it comes to the saves. But the cast time is too long, the effects are too minor, the duration is too short, and there's always better things to do with my action, whether at low levels or high levels. So I think this is just a bad spell, and it's not one of the worst spells at level 1, but it's just a bad spell. Yet I consistently see Doom talked about as though it's a quality option in the level 1 priest book, and it's just not. So let's get into why. First of all, what does the spell do? Well, it has a cast time of 9 for a duration of 1 turn and an effect on 1 enemy creature. So 10 rounds, but it takes almost an entire round to cast it. And again, cast time 9 spells on a cleric are really punishing. You don't have alacrity to get out more spells than the one you chose to cast in the round. And if you have a cast time of 9, you don't have Vecna, or I guess you have amulet power to reduce it to 8, but you're missing Vecna to get that 9 down to 4. And you're also missing some powerful priest auto attacks by spending an entire round standing there and casting this level 1 spell to minorly debuff 1 enemy creature for 10 turns, or 10 rounds, or about 10 times the time that it cost to cast the thing in the first place. So the opportunity cost of casting this spell with a cast time of 9 is just really high. And then what does the spell get you? Well, the description says that Doom causes the target to receive a -2 penalty to all his rolls, including THAC0 and saving throws. Again, the description leaves a lot to be desired. That makes it sound like this could be like a luck effect, which would be a lot more powerful. Certainly, it makes it seem like there's something other than THAC0 and saving throws that this spell affects. But no, that's not true. The only two things that Doom affects are the Thaco and saving throws of one creature, and it applies this -2 penalty to each. Now, I'm going to spend most of my time on the saves penalty, because I think when people think that this is a strong spell, they're mostly thinking about that -2 saves penalty. To dispense with the Thaco penalty, I mean, a Thaco penalty or bonus is one of the most minor buffs or debuffs possible in the game. Thaco is a D20 concept. Even if Thaco is debuffed, there's still always critical hits and critical misses. So you're never truly safe just on the basis of debuffing enemy Thaco. This is affecting one enemy creature's Thaco by 2 pips, and of course Thaco's a D20 concept. So the odds change to hit is, in absolute terms, is going to be at most 10%. In actuality, it's always less than that because of the impact of critical misses and critical hits on the Thaco odds. It's the same as equipping a shield, right? I mean, that's the nature of the bonus. And on top of that, Doom is only applying that Thaco penalty to a single enemy creature. In addition, the way Thaco works in this game, I brought this up repeatedly, but at low levels, you're going to need a lot more help than -2 Thaco penalty to protect yourself. When your armor stinks, you don't have a lot of buffs, your enemies have decent enough Thaco to hit you if they have a good roll, and this -2 penalty is not really changing that. At later levels, Thaco starts to become pretty much irrelevant because your enemies are all going to have massive strength, like demons, high-level undead, et cetera, all have really high strength scores. And again, a -2 penalty is not going to really have an impact because Thaco of enemies is also majorly negative. In the phase of the game when Thaco matters at all, which is the early stages, then you're way better off taking a command, which is going to guarantee you hits, and also completely take that enemy out of the fight for a round, versus just a minor -2 penalty to Thaco to one enemy, which is hardly noticeable. So the Thaco penalty is just the definition of meh. It's just neither here nor there. It doesn't really have a place in the game. It's not worth a cast time of 9 ever. Now the saves penalty. So without really thinking about the math or running the math or thinking about the odds, in concept, a -2 saves penalty sounds good. Again, you're giving up a cast time of 9 and the option to cast any higher level spell during combat when you cast this spell. But yeah, okay, in theory, you might think that a -2 saves penalty is worth taking the spell for. There's not that many ways in the game to affect enemy saves. Of course, the number one way is with Greater Malison. Greater Malison applies a -4 penalty, and it's also AoE. Obviously, this spell is much more marginal. On top of that, Greater Malison has a cast time of 4, can be cast inside an Alacrity, and has a cast time of 0 with Robe of Vecna. Whereas Doom, you get to a point where Greater Malison late in the game doesn't really have any opportunity cost, because you can just chuck it out during an Alacrity for a cast time of 0. With Doom, you're never going to have that option. You're going to get to the point where saving throws matter at all in the saga, which is much later in the saga, and you're going to have to give up powerful cleric auto attacks, or you're going to be giving up casting like a Divine Protection, a Implosion. If you're a druid, a Insect Plague, you're going to be giving up casting a Heal, a Greater Restoration. These really, really strong spells. Instead, because you don't have Alacrity and you're going to use your entire action for the round, you're in a position where you're mid BG2 to TOB when saves actually matter at all, because there's just more magic in the game and you're facing enemies with lower saves. And the concept of giving up a much higher level spell in combat to stand there for not a cast time of 9 and get out a spell that's going to do a -2 saves penalty to one creature is just, once you start to really think about it, it's just not realistic. I could stop there, but instead, to prove the point, I'm going to go into, like I did with Malison, the exact math and odds around the impact of applying a -2 penalty to saves. So that's what I've done in the sheet here. And the basic question that I'm trying to answer is it better to cast Doom and apply the -2 saves penalty and then start casting damage or debuff or disable spells against the target? Or is it better to just forget Doom exists and take the first round to cast the damage spell or debuff spell that you were trying to tee up for, right? I mean, in a way, part of the negative aspect of a spell like Malison or Doom is that reducing enemy saves it's only a means to an end. It's never an end in and of itself. Your enemies don't drop dead like they had their brains devoured by a mind flayer when they get their saves reduced by 2. Instead, they're just sitting there on the exact same HP. You haven't actually disabled or damaged them. So you're giving up a round of spellcasting during which you could be casting a damage or a debuff spell, and you're instead reducing that creature's saves. For that to make sense, it has to be the case that you're getting a better outcome or better odds of success if you go Doom, spell, 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 or Doom, spell, spell, versus just going spell, spell, spell. So that's the math that I'm going to try to run through. Now what's showing here is just the simple odds impact of casting Doom on one creature. So at the left here is the enemy creature's saving throw, and then your odds that the enemy is going to fail save, so the odds that your spell will hit for full damage, or that your debuff will go off, or disable will go off. And then at the right, I'm showing what the as adjusted saving throw is after the penalty, and the odds that your enemy will fail save after the Doom -2 has been applied. And then here in column I show how much you've changed your odds as a multiple of your prior odds. So what this is showing is that, yes, look, for an ultra powerful magic resistant via saves enemy like a Lich or a Greater Mummy, you can be in a position where they're going to make every save before being debuffed. And by casting Doom, you take that enemy from a saving throw of 1 to 3, and then your odds are infinitely better of making the debuff effect that you're trying to get go off work. But for these types of enemies, first of all, by the time you're fighting them, you have access to much more powerful spells than Doom. Second, the infinitely higher chance that goes from 0 to some odds is still a very small chance of success. Like for an enemy with a saving throw of 1 that you then push to a 3, you still have to have the enemy roll a 1 or a 2 in order to miss save. So there's just not a place for these types of enemies. You're trying to just pummel them with enough damage spells that it doesn't matter if they save, they're still going to die, or you're going to try to debuff them and kill them with physical damage. That's not what this small change from a 0 to a 10% chance of success is giving you. And then for the enemies that are more susceptible to failing saves, so enemies with more typical saving throws like 5 through 13, beholders through ankegs, for those enemies, you are improving your odds, but the odds improvement is really quite marginal, right? You're making yourself 1.3 to 1.2 times more likely to make your spells land by applying a saves penalty of 2. So how do we quantify this? Well, let's think about damage spells first. And in a way, the math is most intuitive or simplest to think about with a damage spell. So the basic question as to whether Doom is worthwhile when your goal is to apply damage from spells to your enemies, the basic question is, are you better off just casting all damage spells, like just have your priests consistently cast Flame Strike or whatever other damage spell they're casting, and never cast the Doom? Or is there ever a situation where you want to cast the Doom first because then your damage from the subsequent damage spell casts are going to be so increased that it's worthwhile? Well, this math answers that question, and the answer is the same as for Malison, but the answer is no. You're never better off if you're killing your enemies with AoE or single target damage where there's a save versus spell for half, which is many spells in the game. You're just never ever better off taking a round to cast Doom first instead of just letting another damage spell fly in that first round. And I'm going to try to quantify that with the math here. So I take as the example, again, I'm going to use a level 10 Skull Trap. A level 10 Skull Trap, if your enemies make save, it does an average or expected damage of 17.5. If your enemies fail save, that's going to do 35 damage. So what this math is calculating is pre-Doom, the expected damage on a level 10 Skull Trap, which is a function of your chance to save pre-Doom and multiplying that the chance that you save, or the save probability versus the chance that you don't save. So for enemies with saving throws of 1 or below that are always going to make save, then your expected damage is always going to be that 17.5 because the enemies are always going to save and take half damage. And then above that, as your save chances, the chances of making save reduce, your Skull Trap gets more powerful and it starts doing probabilistically more expected damage, right? All the way up to a hypothetical enemy that has a save of 20, so it basically never makes its save versus spell, is going to take almost the full 35 damage on average each time. Okay, that's in the pre-Doom world. Now, post-Doom, what I've done here is this just shifts all the probabilities up by 2 by debuffing, by applying the -2 saves penalty, right? So now an enemy that it started with a saving throw of 15 has expected damage on a saving throw of 13. Now, what you can see here, even just eyeballing it, is that the difference on a 2 pip difference, or the impact of Doom, is extremely marginal. We're talking about like an expected 1.75 extra damage, right? That's what this cell here, H, is. That's what this column H is calculating. The additional expected damage that you're generating by applying the -2 saves penalty. Now, the thing that jumps out is that 1.75 additional expected damage is only 1/10 of the damage that your enemy would take if you simply took your first round or your priest round to cast a damage spell instead of casting Doom. So the end result is that in order to be better off casting Doom instead of just taking the first round to cast another damage spell, in this example, you need to hit the enemy with between 10 and 20, or in the most extreme case, 39 for this fringe scenario. But you need to be hitting the enemy with 10 to 18 or 19 skull traps in this example before you're better off having applied the saves penalty versus just having used the first round of casting to deliver 17.5 to 35 damage. The end result is that almost every enemy in the game is dead after taking 14 or 15 skull traps, right? This is going to be like a minimum of 15 times 17.5 damage, or like a minimum of 263 damage, and that's if they make save every time. It's probably more like 300 to 400 damage. I mean, every enemy in the game is dead by the time that you even get to the break-even point of having been better off casting Doom. And of course, if you're consistently applying damage instead of skipping around to cast Doom and then applying damage, then the enemy's going to start taking damage and have a higher probability of dying sooner, which is always better for you in terms of defending yourself. So what the math clearly shows is that you're just never, ever better off casting Doom instead of casting some offensive damage spell and just continuously casting damage spells. You don't need the benefit of the -2 penalty. You just pummel your enemies and you're going to kill them much quicker that way. Now, the other scenario where a saves penalty might be helpful is if you're, instead of applying damage spells, if your strategy is to hit your enemies with spells that there's a save to negate, right? So debuffs, single target kill spells like Finger Death or Disintegrate. In this scenario, the math is a little bit different because it's not a matter of calculating expected damage from a spell based on whether the enemy saves or not. It's a matter of what's your odds of the enemy failing save. And the comparison to decide whether Doom and its -2 penalty is worthwhile is whether you're better off just casting the offensive spell multiple times in a row, or whether you're better off casting Doom first. So like in the example of a hold person spell, are you better off just casting hold person 3 times in a row against the enemy and doing that with your divine casters? Or are you better off casting Doom first, and then because the probability change in your favor is so strong, you're better off casting Doom and 2 hold persons? So that's what this math is showing. At left, and this is all done off of a save versus spell, but the logic is the same on a save versus death, or etc. At left here, what column E is showing is for enemies with this saving throw, with a certain saving throw, what are your odds of having your debuff go off if you cast it 2 times? And in the column F is your odds of having the debuff go off against an enemy with this spell, with this save or spell level or save level, if you cast the spell 3 times. I mean, as you'd expect, your odds increase significantly the more times you cast the spell and force your enemies to save. All right, this is just for a given save versus spell, whether debuffed by Doom or not. What are your odds if you cast your spell twice or 3 times in getting the spell to succeed? Okay, then what I look at over here is the relationship between your chances of success if you cast Doom and then the offensive spell, so like Doom first round, then hold person, versus if you just cast hold person twice. And what the math is showing is that in virtually every scenario, you are better off just casting hold person twice, because your odds are worse casting Doom and then casting the spell once versus the odds of just casting the offensive spell twice. Okay, so clearly you need to be casting spells against enemies that have save to negate. At least you need to be casting for at least more than 2 rounds to have Doom ever pay off. If you expand this to looking at casting Doom and the spell twice versus the spell 3 times, in this scenario, it's closer to break even, right? For a lot of starting saves, your odds of success with Doom and casting the spell twice is pretty much even with Doom and casting 3 times. So that's kind of the break-even point. Doom starts to become worthwhile, and the -2 saves penalty starts to become worthwhile if you have 4 or more rounds where you're attempting to cast a save to negate spell against the enemy. What's that circumstance? And this doesn't factor in the fact that if you cast Doom, you're giving up all your chances of paralyzing or debuffing or killing the enemy in the first round. I just think Unless you're deliberately trying to go for some non-damage based strategy where you're like only killing enemies with Finger of Death and Disintegrate, and you're only killing enemies by trying to stun them or something, and so you're going to cast like 5 stuns or 6 stuns against every enemy in every fight. Like the point at which you break even after taking a round to cast Doom is just so late in a fight that it's not worthwhile. You have to be 4+ rounds into casting a save to negate spell against that enemy for Doom to really start paying off. And that's not even taking into account, again, the fact that you didn't do anything round 1, or the fact that you have to give up valuable priest auto attacks to cast this time 9 spell. All right, that's a lot of math to get to the basic point that a -2 saves penalty is just not very strong. The spell's not fun to cast. You spend 9 ticks casting it, and nothing happens right when you cast it. You're just teeing up for something else. Your enemies are just going to keep coming at you, and they haven't taken any damage. So there's just no place for this in casting. There's always something better to cast. It's not giving you absolutely nothing, but what it is giving you is very marginal. If you do like debuffing enemy saves and you feel like that's powerful, then just use Malison to do so, which is AoE and applies a -4 penalty, and you can shoot it out during an Alacrity. Do not use the Doom spell. I think this is an overrated spell. I'm never taking this. My level 1, I'd much rather be taking Armor of Faith, Sanctuaries, early on commands, protection from evil. Like, there's so many options in level 1, even when you start to have a ton of level 1 slots that are much better than this spell. So I'll go with a 3 out of 10 for the Doom spell. That is an okay spell, but still very situational or hard to justify against other spells at the level. Yeah. Next up, Magical Stone. Magical Stone has a range of 50 feet, duration instant, cast time of 4, AoE 1 creature, no save. By using this spell, the priest can create a small magical pebble, which then flies out and hits a target opponent. The stone deals 1d4 points of damage to whomever it hits. The stones are considered +1 weapons for determining if a creature can be struck, those struck only by magical weapons, for instance, although they do not have an attack or damage bonus. Okay, woo. This is just one of the lamest spells in all of Baldur's Gate. I guess it's the divine version of Magic Missile, and by that I mean that the game is telling you early on that divine casters will feel very lame when using offensive magic compared to mages. What this spell does, it conjures a small projectile that looks like a sling bullet. After the cast time of 4, the projectile flies out automatically, and it'll strike one enemy for 1d4 magic damage. That's it. There's no attack roll to hit, so it is a guaranteed hit. You're going to get 1d4 damage. You don't have to test your THAC0. It's really just like a magic missile in that sense, but a magic missile that takes 4 times as long to cast. It has 0 scaling, like you never get additional pebbles or stones like you do missiles. And even at level 1, it's doing less damage than Magic Missile because Magic Missile does 1d4 plus 1 per missile, and this just does 1d4. So obviously this is like an early BG1 type of spell. I guess the reason to cast it would be if your THAC0 is terrible, so you don't really want to use your sling as a priest. But if you're in that world, then you clearly just take a command over this spell and stun your enemy and make your auto attacks hit. That's going to do much more damage than just this 1d4 points of magic damage. There's no world where you would choose this spell over command to do damage in the early game. And later on in the game, by the time you get anywhere, basically, by the time you're a half hour into the game, there's really no place to take up your action spell casting for a round just to do 1d4 magic damage to a single target. This is just kind of a filler spell, crappy spell. I honestly do not think I've ever cast this spell in a real playthrough at any point. Like even 13-year-old myself looking at this, you read the description and you realize it sucks immediately and you just move on. I will rate Magical Stone a 2 out of 10. Not a good spell. Next up, Protection from Evil. Okay, this has a duration of 1 turn or 10 rounds, a cast time of 4, AoE 1 creature, no save. When this spell is cast, it creates a magical barrier around the recipient at a distance of 1 foot. The barrier moves with the recipient and has 2 major effects. First, all attacks made by evil or evilly enchanted creatures against the protected creature receive a penalty of -2 to each attack roll. Second, summons demons cannot target the protected creature. Okay, Protection from Evil. It's in some ways the quintessential divine spell. In a sense, priests will protect party members from evil. There is an arcane version of this spell at level 1 as well, which has the same effect of giving you a +2 effective AC bonus applied as an attack penalty for all evil enemies, but effective AC bonus against evil attackers. Although the arcane version lasts for 2 rounds per level, or 20 rounds, or two turns at the max level, whereas the divine version I guess the spell description is not right. The divine version lasts 3 rounds per level. Okay, yeah, I looked through the code on this. My version of the game is heavily modded, and it says 1 turn for the duration, but that's not right. Maybe that typo's in the non-modded version as well. But yeah, this is not actually a 1 turn duration in the coding. It's 3 rounds per level. 3 rounds per level, maxing out at level 20. So that's 60 rounds in total, or 6 turns, or 6 in real life minutes for the max duration at level 20. So yeah, there actually is some decent duration to this spell, and it's longer than the arcane version, or 1.5 times as long, because arcane is 2 rounds per level, divine is 3 rounds per level. So right when you get this at level 1, this is I guess another spell in level 1 that has some scaling to it, not in the powerfulness of the effect, but at least in duration. Right when you get this at level 1, it's going to have a super short duration of 3 rounds, never worth casting. But then, as you start to level, you can get some decent duration out of this. Protection from Evil used to be a lot more powerful. It used to grant a +2 bonus to saving throws versus evil as well, which is a nice buff. The Enhanced Edition removed this effect, making the only impacts the protection from summoned demons, which seems to be kind of buggy. You're not encountering demons until much later in the game when you have better protection from evil spells anyway. But you get protection from summoned demons and the enemy penalty to attack rolls. A +2 bonus to AC is not a massive bonus, and in addition, by the time you get to level 4, which does have plenty of spell slots in level 4 in the Divine Book, you get access to Protection from Evil 10-foot radius, which has a 3.3 times longer duration of 1 turn per level, and it's also AoE. So that's obviously the much better spell, both in terms of duration and in terms of protecting your whole party. That's an okay spell at level 4. And you're just not going to take the level 1 version once you have enough level 4 spell slots that you can take Protection from Evil 10-foot radius at level 4. For level 1 Divine, in terms of a rating for this spell or how good it is, for level 1 Divine spellcasting, this level is such a wasteland in the Priest book. There are so many spells that have no utility at all beyond the very early levels. This is one of the very few spells, there's probably only really 3 or maybe 4 in the level 1 book that have any type of scalability, staying power, or relevance past very early BG1. And this is one of those spells. By the time you get it scaled up in duration, you have tons of level 1 slots. Sometimes I find myself using this in like a late BG1 or early BG2 fight when I can just add one more buff to my cleric for a slight more tankiness in battle. I know it's going to last me for a couple fights. I've already got my Armor of the Faith up, and I may as well stock this for the toughest battles because it's giving me a protection that if I'm, late BG1, there's not a lot of level 4 slots, so I might not be taking the 10-foot radius version. And I would rely on this spell at level 1 to pick up the protection from evil buff. So there is some phase of the game in the middle of the saga where this is at least viable and it's giving you something. So I think it's just an okay spell that's worth considering in the mid game. And I will give protection from evil out of the Divine level 1 book a 4 out of 10 rating. Next spell is Remove Fear. This has a castable range of 30 feet, a duration of 1 hour, a cast time of 1, very fast, AoEs of 15-foot radius. The priest instills courage in the spell's recipients, raising their morale to its highest. The recipient's morale will gradually reset to normal as the duration runs out. If the recipients are affected by magical fear, this is negated. Okay, Remove Fear. So here we have an AoE buff that will affect friendly creatures only. This is the same as the level 2 arcane spell Resist Fear, although this spell in the Divine book is easier to find room for in your spell slots given the abundance of level 1 Divine spells you'll find yourself with. The duration here is very long. That's really nice. It has a duration of 1 hour of in-game time. That's 5 in real life minutes. It's 5 turns or 50 rounds. That's really pretty long for a spell that you can cast right out of Candlekeep. You don't have to scale into that. So you can put this thing on and go through a whole dungeon or part of a dungeon and several battles without worrying about it running off, even if you're at low level. Now, what does the spell do? I'll say I'm really confused by the names of these spells. The effect of this spell is exactly the same as Resist Fear in the Arcane book, but it's called Remove Fear. And if you didn't read the description or understand how Baldur's Gate works, then you might think that the only time it's useful to cast this is when one of your party members has already been feared, and now you want to bring them out of Yellow Circle and remove the fear. However, the real use case is, you could call this spell Resist Fear as well. The real use case is that if your party members or your main character is under the effect of this spell, then you can't be feared in the first place, which of course is the goal of a buff. You're trying to avoid negative debuffs in the first place, and that's what this spell does. It will have this benefit of improving morale to make morale breaks impossible. I already talked about that. Under Bless, morale is really not that relevant. The main character cannot break from the party. The commonality of other party members having morale failure is pretty low, especially past early BG1. That said, if you were fighting with a bunch of morale break 6 creatures and one of them was a tank like Khalid, or you were expecting to take a lot of damage, it's worth, you'd say it's worth keeping one instance of Remove Fear in your spell book, because this would be the way, unlike the Bless spell, which only increases the morale variable by 1, this spell would be the way to make sure that none of your party drop for morale reasons. The effect of this spell in blocking fear or panic is much more useful though, because enemies will cast horror against you right from Tarnesh outside the friendly Armin in the early parts of the game. And then once you get into BG2, there are a lot of enemies that SCS gives like fear auras. And if for some reason you don't have the higher level anti-enchantment spells up on your whole party, like Chaotic Commands or much later Impervious Sanctity of Mind, then it's not a bad idea to keep a version of this or just cast it, because it has a decent duration of an hour on your whole party to make sure that you avoid getting feared through one of those fear auras or a horror spell. So there's some utility to this for sure. Now, later on in the saga, like by mid BG2 and all the way through TOB, this spell does get totally obsoleted, I think. Your saves start to be really strong. You're getting saves for your whole party down to 1 or below, and fear effects always give you a chance to save. And on top of that, you're going to get access to much better anti-enchantment protections that you're going to want to have up on your whole party because they protect you from chaos, confusion, and charm. And as sort of a added bonus, these buffs also protect you against fear. That's sort of how the higher level anti-enchantment spells all work. They will protect you from the stuff that's really nasty and you actually face and care about, like confusion, chaos, and charm. But then as an added bonus, they'll all protect you from fear as well. So chaotic commands, impervious sanctity of mind, these spells, you're going to want to be using them as much as possible, and they're going to protect against fear. And once you apply those stronger buffs, you sort of don't need this one anymore. Overall, there's nothing super special as to what this spell does. It's a counter spell to a pretty moderately or rarely used debuff overall, being the fear debuff. But it's something that you'll encounter, like fear spells or fear auras, something you'll encounter through the whole saga. And it's an effect that's pretty devastating if it affects enough of your party or your player character. So this is, I think, a decent spell to just have one available on a cleric in your party at all times. And overall, this is not a bad spell. I rated the same spell, or resist fear, in the arcane book a 3 out of 10. But in the arcane book, the spell was taking up a more valuable level 2 arcane slot. In the divine book, just giving up a level 1 slot, if you have high wisdom divine casters, you're going to have so many level 1 slots. It's much easier to give up a divine level 1 slot. So in the divine book, this spell is just better than it is in the arcane book. I think this is either a 5 or 6 out of 10 spell. And I guess because I'm going on an SCS-based ratings guide now, I'll go with 6 out of 10 because of the prevalence of fear auras in SCS. So it can be helpful to have one of these on backup in your party through most of the saga. And there's a chance that it'll come in handy all the way through to the point where you have just tons of level 5, 6, and 7 slots, and you have lots of slots for chaotic commands and impervious sanctity of mind and so forth. Okay, so a pretty decent spell here. Nice duration, blocks a nasty debuff, and I'll go 6 out of 10 for remove fear. Next spell is Sanctuary. Sanctuary has a duration of 1 turn, a cast time of 4, area of effect the caster. When the priest casts a Sanctuary spell, it causes all of his opponents to ignore his existence as if he were invisible. While protected by this spell, the subject cannot take direct offensive action without breaking the spell, but may use non-attack spells or otherwise act in any way that does not violate the prohibition against offensive action. This allows a warded priest to heal wounds, for example, or to bless himself. The priest cannot cast spells on other creatures without ending the spell. All right, so this is the divine version of invisibility, really. Divine casters do not get invisibility spells of the quality from the Mage Book, but they do get access to their own version of invisibility, and they get access earlier, right from the start of the game, through this level 1 spell, Sanctuary. With a cast time of 4, this is not the fastest spell to get off, but it's still possible to run away and then have time to cast this if you're in a tight spot in battle. You're always going to favor invisibility potions for immediately getting yourself out of trouble if you're cornered or have taken too much damage to run away early in the saga. But if you're not in a desperate spot, or if you're just out of it, an invis potion, then a cast time of 4 is not so horrible. You could usually scramble away and have enough time to cast this on yourself before melee enemies could catch up. I really think generally, though, this is not your top choice to protect yourself if you're in the heat of battle. Where I think Sanctuary shines is really that the rules that apply to breaking it are a bit different and more favored to the caster than invisibility. So Sanctuary can be used to take offensive actions that an invisible mage cannot, especially at early levels and against some enemies that would kill you in a straight up fight. And I'll get into more detail about what I mean by that. So it's a bit more useful than invisibility because of the way that Sanctuary works. It's not an invisibility spell. Instead, there's some game code that makes enemies ignore you when you have a Sanctuary up. And the things that break a Sanctuary are just a bit different and more freeing for the caster, or allow you to do more things while sanctuaried than you can do while invisible. So there's some utility there to being able to do certain things to set up fights or run in and take items and so forth that Sanctuary allows you to do a bit better than invisibility. So that's, I think, where it's really useful, is as an out of battle cast to allow you to sneak around and do certain things or set up for a battle. The duration on Sanctuary, it's 1 turn or 10 rounds. There's no scalability. That's a lot shorter than Arcane Invisibility. Like when you get Invisibility in level 2 of the Arcane book, that has a 24-hour in-game time duration. So Sanctuary is shorter, but that's still plenty of time to get done what you need. 10 rounds is plenty of time to either get into position to get the first hit or sneak around and take some items or what have you. So the duration is still plenty long. All right, now I'm going to get more into detail on how exactly the Sanctuary spell works and what breaks it in particular. And I'll divide this up into 2 sections. First, the actions of the caster, or your own actions that can break it, and then enemy spells that will dispel it. So first, breaking it yourself. So just like invisibility, Sanctuary breaks if you attack a enemy creature, like was a physical attack. It breaks if you cast an AoE damage spell or a spell that the game deems to be an offensive spell. Or it breaks if you cast a single target damage spell or another spell that the game deems to be an offensive spell. Just like invisibility, this spell does not break if you're casting an AoE or a single target buff on yourself. So you can definitely be inside a Sanctuary and rebuff yourself to go back into fight, and then the Sanctuary is not going to break just by you casting buff spells on yourself, for the most part. Here is where I say for the most part, because the real distinction is that I think every spell in the game has some type of variable that determines whether it's considered an offensive spell or not, and that doesn't always line up with whether the spell with what you would think. But generally speaking, damage is always going to be considered offensive and break this, and then pretty much every debuff in the game, with a couple exceptions I'll get into, are going to be considered offensive spells. That's already a little bit different than Invis, in the sense that what's breaking the Sanctuary is whether the spell is considered offensive or not. And to be more specific on how Sanctuary is different than Invis, in Sanctuary, you can cast AoE spells that are not classified as offensive without breaking it, even if those spells will affect enemy creatures. With invisibility, you don't have the ability to cast AoE. You can cast self-buff single target spells, but if you cast an AoE buff or an AoE spell that could affect enemies, you're going to break your invis. That's not true with Sanctuary. Now, again, it's very hard to predict which spells will be classified as an offensive spell and break the Sanctuary. There's not really a logic to it, but I can tell you what matters in practice. And if there's others you think are helpful that don't break the Sanctuary, put it in the comments. The best example I can think of a spell that would probably break Invis, or does break Invis, but does not break Sanctuary, is Silence. The level 2 priest spell, which we'll get into in next level. You can cast Silence on a group of enemies without breaking Sanctuary. So that's incredibly helpful. That's a great way to fight powerful casters in the very beginning of Baldur's Gate 1. Now with SCS gives every arcane caster past like mid BG1 vocalization. So silence becomes of increasingly limited utility. It retains its utility against divine casters. Like this dynamic of sanctuary plus being able to cast silence is a really easy way to kill basilisk, for example. Or the because silence is not considered an offensive spell, like you can go in and kill the priest that's in the temple just to the east of Baraghost, who's like 10k XP, and all of the sirens there. And you could sit in a sanctuary if you wanted and just cast silence endlessly against that priest. And the priest is not going to be able to take action against you or be able to see you. You're not going to break your sanctuary, and you could cast silence 4, 5, 6 times until the priest fails save, and then is not going to be able to cast any spells in that fight. So this is a good tool. I also use this a lot in the fight just outside the Cloakwood Mines with those 2 strong mages that will cast confusion or charm spells on your party if you don't have them disabled. I'll run in there with a sanctuary on and try to silence those mages before the spell starts. So silence is just one example, but it's probably the chief example of how with sanctuary, there's certain spells that impact other creatures that aren't considered offensive that allow you to run around being sanctuaried, being invis, and still get those spells off. With Sanctuary on, you can also cast single target buffs on other creatures, whether friend or foe. I mean, you wouldn't want to cast a buff on an enemy, but this is another difference from invisibility. With Sanctuary, you can cast a Death Ward or a Protection from Evil on another creature that's not yourself and not break the Sanctuary. Normally, if you have Invis on, casting any spell on any other creature would break the invisibility. So that's something. I mean, I don't really know about the practical utility of this. In SCS especially, True Sight becomes so ubiquitous that you're not going to be able to keep your Sanctuary up for very long during any battle. And also, while you're Sanctuaried, you can't take your 1 to 2 auto attacks pre-haste per round as a priest, which are pretty valuable. So it's rare that you would go into Sanctuary for most of the saga during battle other than to protect yourself. There's not really a great strategy of remaining Sanctuaried when you can wear full plate and have all these defensive spells and have good auto attacks and just having your role as a priest to be able to run around and cast single target buffs on your party during battle. But that is something you can do. You're not going to break Sanctuary by casting a single target buff. And then the last thing that you can do that's different than Invis is that you can open doors and chests or loot stashes with Sanctuary on and not break the Sanctuary. This one is actually pretty big early on in the game because it allows you from level 1 to get in and loot some high priority items very early in the game if you want them. That's much harder to do with Arcane Invisibility because first, you don't even get that to level 2. And with Arcane Invis, like if you're a level 1 through 3 caster and you really want the Wand of Fire, because that's one of the most powerful items in BG1 and getting it early on is a huge power spike for you, you can get one shot by the Ankeg that's sitting right outside the Wand of Fire in the Ankeg cave if you go in and break your Invis and then have to recast Invis on yourself. I guess if you use a potion, if you always have enough potions, you can avoid that. You can loot the stash and then immediately pot and go invis again before you can get attacked. But there's just more risk and more item utilization and more prep to trying to use invis to loot stashes with strong enemies around them than Sanctuary. With Sanctuary, you just put the Sanctuary on, you walk straight in, you can fully loot the chest, take everything, and nobody's going to attack you because the looting action doesn't break the Sanctuary. So that's pretty helpful very early on in the saga, when you're very low level, but there's some items that are going to help you a lot. The Constitution Manual, the Paralyzation Wand in the Flesh Golem Cave. If you're very focused on getting the cost of some high cost items down, there's the Charisma Tome that in my version of the game, there's 3 really strong cave bears in that cave that has the Charisma Tome in the Knoll Fort area. And then, of course, the Wand of Fire is probably the number one item in the Ankeg layer, that if you can grab it as for an arcane caster in your party from level 1, you can start to take on fights that you really should not be able to from very early in the game. So yeah, in sum, Sanctuary, it allows you to do a bit more without breaking it, and that does come in handy in actual gameplay. You can cast AoE spells that are not classified as offensive, like Silence. You can cast single target buffs on other creatures without breaking it, and you can open doors and chests and loot stashes. All right, that's your own conduct. Now, what dispels Sanctuary as far as enemy spell casting? Well, Dispel and Remove Magic will get rid of it, so that's something to be careful of. In SCS, the game gives you many super high level casters that can cast Dispel or Remove Magic against you at levels much higher than you're at. All the mages in late BG1, like the Semaj, Angelo in the final fight against Saravak, all the many Yuan-Ti mages that you face in BG2, and they're like a level 17 mage spamming level 5+ spells at you right from the beginning of BG2. Like, all those mages are gonna get rid of this through Dispel and Remove Magic, so that's something to look out for. Then, as far as anti-illusion spells, all of the level 3+ anti-illusion spells from the Arcane book will get rid of this. So True Sight will get rid of it, Detect Illusion will get rid of it. Notably, Invisibility Purge or Detect Invis will not get rid of Sanctuary. So again, that makes this spell slightly better than level 2 Invisibility, or even as far as what gets rid of it, a Shadow Door or a level 4 Improved Invis, because those spells in the Arcane book are all purged with Invisibility Purge or Detect Invis, which are the lowest level anti-invis spells in the Divine and Arcane book. But Sanctuary is not. You need a bit higher anti-illusion spell to get rid of Sanctuary. Now, in practice, in SCS, enemy arcane casters have access to True Sight super early on, and right from the beginning of BG2 certainly. And so this isn't that important of a distinction, or doesn't make Sanctuary that much more powerful. Enemy mages are just going to get rid of this with True Sight from early BG2, and you don't have spell immunity divination to protect yourself as a priest. So again, in combat, as far as a combat protection, the utility of this is pretty low to begin with, and then it really drops off to almost nil by late in the saga, once enemies have access to True Sight. But this is good to know if you're facing a priest that uses Sanctuary, and the SCS scripting does have enemy priests cast Sanctuary on themselves all the way through BG2 and TOB. Like, Drow priests will do this all the time. You need to be aware that you're going to need a anti-illusion spell beyond Invisibility Purge or Detect Invis to get rid of that Sanctuary. So overall, what is this? It's an Invis spell, but with a bit more utility than a standard Invis spell. You're not getting any of the huge saves or AC bonuses that you get from Improved Invis, so it's not really a late game tool, and it does get obsoleted. But it's a nice tool to tee up fights early on to get that first attack or position yourself properly, and to get some items that early on that are very helpful to avoid dying early on in BG1. If this had a faster cast time, or in the base game, this might be more like a 6 or 7 out of 10 type spell. But with the pretty long cast time of 4 and the fixed duration of 10 rounds, I think it's just a solid spell with limited uses through at least part of the saga. So that would be a 5 out of 10 rating for Sanctuary. In SCS, any spell that doesn't hold up through True Sight is really limited on a Divine caster because of the prevalence of enemy casters casting True Sight. But through BG1 period, and if ever later on you don't have access to an Invis pot and you need to just protect yourself for a part of a round, the spell does have utility. Pretty decent spell. 5 out of 10 for Sanctuary. All right, next up is Shillelagh. Shillelagh is a plant sphere, combat and plant sphere spell with a duration of 4 rounds plus 1 round per level, a cast time of 2,
AoE is special because it puts a magical weapon into the caster's hand. This spell enables the caster to create a magical cudgel that has a +1 bonus to its attack roll and inflicts 2d4 points of damage on opponents. Okay, first of all, this is pronounced Shillelagh. Google told me. Shillelagh is a English Gaelic word that refers to a typically Irish walking stick or club made out of blackthorn or oak wood. And shillelaghs have come to be known as a typical Irish weapon or a symbol of Irish hand-to-hand combat. And my last piece of trivia is that at least according to Wikipedia, it looks more like a cane to me, but the Boston Celtics leprechaun is leaning on a shillelagh. Okay, so that's what a shillelagh is. It's a stick. It's a stick. And yeah, this spell is about as strong as you would expect for conjuring a stick into your hand, and about as useful as that. This spell is another one of those that I probably looked at like literally 25 years ago and immediately realized the spell sucks. What is this doing? It's creating a magical weapon, and it's putting the magical weapon in your main hand. You get this green club, and no, this suffers from all of the typical problems of magical weapons. It's going to take your regular weapon out of your hand and replace it with this weapon. Also, it's like almost all magical weapons, it's going to ignore your weapon pips. Now, if you're a pure class cleric, you can only ever get one pip, so you're at best have no bonuses or penalties to your THAC0 or damage with a weapon. If you're a fighter cleric, then immediately this is going to nerf you because you're going to lose your weapon pips and lose your bonuses from your weapon pips. And normally enchanted weapons try to make up the fact that they're taking away your proficiencies by giving you something that's good on the weapon, but the stats on this thing are a joke. First of all, the 2d4 damage, that's just the same as a regular Morningstar. That's it. 2d4 Morningstar. You can pick up from the first area of the entire game. The only difference is this +1 bonus to attack roll and the fact that magical weapons don't apply an offhand THAC0 penalty if you're dual wielding. Now, you still get the main hand THAC0 penalty if you're dual wielding, which can be pretty brutal early on in the game, a penalty of 2, even if you have a pip in 2 weapon style. But I guess your 1 APR with your offhand is not going to be completely impossible to hit without stunning opponents. It's just going to be still quite impossible to hit because you're not going to have the +6 THAC0 penalty applied to your offhand if you're dual wielding with this thing. So those are really the distinctions. You get a +1 THAC0 bonus, and then your offhand is not going to have a penalty if you choose to dual wield while you have the shillelagh in your main hand. Those bonuses are just so minor and inconsequential. The second that you can pick up a +1 weapon, which is very early on in Baldur's Gate, especially for flails and Morningstars, you can go kill the party that's in the Mutamin area. It's easy to do that with the Wand of Fire or any other AoE damage, and one of them is holding a +1 Morningstar. There's a +1 flail that's on a commoner, one of the fishermen that's in the Ankeg area. I mean, there's lots of ways to get +1 weapons for blunt weapon users. And the second that you do that, within the first hour of gameplay, you're already going to have a permanent weapon that's better than this one because it's going to give you a +1 THAC0 bonus and also be doing, in the case of the Morningstar, 2d4 +1 points of damage. So the only place for this spell ever is right when you're starting out if you think it's so critical that you have a +1 bonus to your THAC0, or you don't have an offhand penalty for 4 rounds plus 1 round per level. But again, the presence of command means that these minor THAC0 bonuses pale in comparison to the benefit of just completely sleeping your enemy and making your main hand and your offhand attacks automatically hit for a round, regardless what your THAC0 is. A +1 bonus to THAC0 and no offhand penalty for 5 rounds when you're starting at level 1 is awful compared to the benefit of a command and getting 2 guaranteed hits. After 5 rounds with your bad starting THAC0, you still might not have made a single hit with the Shillelagh because your THAC0 is still going to be so bad. So this spell, it could have given you like a +2 weapon, or a weapon that does plus fire damage or plus magic damage or something, and it could have lasted 2 or 3 times or 5 times as long and still not been overpowered. Instead, you get this extremely useless spell, just filler in the level 1 spell book. As soon as you have access to any +1 weapon, you're never going to even think about casting it. And even prior to that, you're much better off taking a command to help yourself out in combat. So I'm going to say Shillelagh, this is actually one of the worst spells in the game. 1 out of 10 rating for this spell. Okay, so there's 2 more spells left in the Priest level 1 book, and they're both from SCS. So now we're out of the classic Baldur's Gate Priest spells, and we're into the 2 spells that SCS adds through the Icewind Deification of the Divine Spellcasting book. The first of the 2 spells added by SCS is Curse. Curse has a duration of 6 rounds, a cast time of 9. The AoE is a 15-foot radius. When uttering the Curse spell, the caster lowers the morale of enemy creatures and any saving throws and attack rolls they make by 1. At the instant the spell is completed, it affects all creatures in a 15-foot radius centered on the point selected by the caster. Affected creatures leaving the area are still subject to the spell's effect. Those entering the area after the casting is completed are not. Okay, so Curse. This is simply the opposite of Bless. Definitely a lack of creativity here. Somebody looked at this and said, hey, let's just make an offensive spell that instead of being a buff that adds 1 point of morale, 1 THAC0, and 1 saving throw to your own party, let's make it a debuff that takes away a THAC0, a saving throw, and a morale point. I guess does Bless affect, Bless doesn't do the saving throw thing. It affects damage rolls. So I guess somebody realized that it would be a bit more viable to have Curse debuff saving throws versus -1 damage on your enemies. Regardless, this is pretty much the opposite of Curse that debuffs enemy fighters. It has the same incredibly long cast time of 9 and the same incredibly short duration that has no scaling of 6 rounds. So you're going to spend like 1/7 of the time the spell is even in effect just standing in place and casting the spell. That's very brutal. As far as the strengths of the spell, I've talked plenty enough already about why minor saves penalties are not useful. This spell has the additional problem of its extremely short duration. I will say, I think this spell is actually better than Doom, considering that at least it's AoE. It has the same horrible cast time of 9. At least it's AoE, so it's going to affect every enemy. I think that's better to have a spell that affects every enemy in an AoE and reduces their saving throws by 1 versus Doom that only affects 1 creature but does it by 2. But it's still a pretty crappy and very, very marginal effect. You're going to have a really, really hard time ever finding a scenario where you want to take a cast time of 9 to put a tiny debuff on your enemies for 6 rounds. It just doesn't happen. The only time I've ever cast this spell, ever, is when I was playing with a stacked up spell cast time reducing items on a level cap removed cleric mage and ran out of other spells to cast it in alacrity. So like basically you have to have your opportunity cost of casting this drop to almost nothing, where you have so many spell slots and you have a cleric mage that has massive spell cast time reducing and your book is otherwise empty, then sure, chuck this out. But that's not really within the realm of a typical game situation, and even then what the spell is doing is so marginal. As far as rating, I thought about putting a 3 out of 10 on this because it is better than Doom, I think, and maybe a tiny bit better than Bless. But the spell is just a bad spell that you should never be casting. 2 out of 10 for Curse. Last spell here is Cause Light Wounds. Cause Light Wounds is a spell with a touch duration, so you have to be in melee. Instant duration, cast time of 5. AoE 1 creature, and saving throw half damage. By casting this spell and touching a creature, the priest deals 8 points of damage, save versus spell for half, to the creature's body. This spell has no effect on undead, constructs, or extraplanar creatures. Okay, so just like there's a series of healing spells in the Divine Book, one thing that SCS does with the Icewind Dale spells, or the additional divine spells, is that it creates a counterpart to the heal spell for every single heal spell. So somebody looked at the Divine Book and noticed that there was, in the original set of spells, there was this spell Harm that's the opposite of heal and is like an offensive healing spell that takes away hit points from enemies in melee instead of adds them. And somebody was like, oh, we can add 4 or 5 different spells to the Divine Book if we just dupe out that idea and create an offensive version of every healing spell at every level that there's a healing spell. And thus we get this Cause Light Wound spell, which is totally useless and there's really no reason to ever use it. But I think that was the thinking, is that there should be a offensive version of every healing spell. I guess more specifically, without the SCS spells, the attack versions start only with Cause Serious Wounds at level 4, but SCS and then you have Harm, I think, at level 6. But now, with SCS, there's Cause Light Wounds, Cause Moderate Wounds, and Cause Medium Wounds. Great. Unlike the higher level versions of this spell, like Harm, this spell down at level 1, Cause Light Wounds, does not require an attack to succeed or use a magical weapon mechanic. Instead, it's a simple magic damage spell that works like Magic Missile, but without a projectile. You have to be in melee. The user needs to start the round in contact with the enemy you're trying to cast it against, just like a heal spell. So what we're left with is just simply a very mediocre damage spell. This is going to do either 4 or 8 magic damage to a single target, depending on whether they save or spell. At least it's magic damage type, which is a useful type of damage, but obviously there's no scalability here. Unlike, say, Magic Missile, which keeps adding missiles up to about 2.5 times the damage that this spell does at its max potential of 8. This just will forever, for all parts of the saga, this is always either going to do 4 or 8 points of damage, which is a tiny amount of damage. With the long cast time of 5 and the need to be in melee range, at low levels, you're really likely to be interrupted while you're casting this and have it do nothing. Like, before you get full plate, probably just forget about it. And there's pretty much no scenario at all where you'd rather have this instead of a command. A command is going to allow you early on to guaranteed hit at least 2 auto attacks, many more if you have a party, and that's always going to do more damage than this spell. And command can also be cast at range, and it has a much faster cast time of 1. So there's just no scenario, even very early on in Baldur's Gate, when 4 to 8 damage actually means something. There's just no scenario where you're gonna rather take this instead of a command. You'd much rather have a command, get off a couple auto attacks, and do much more damage to enemies while disabling them. So this is just an irrelevant bad spell. It's kind of in the game I guess on principle that every heal spell should have a damage spell that corresponds in the priest book, but it's really not giving you very much. I think the only potential ratings are a 1 or 2 out of 10. The level 1 or the rating 1 being reserved for the worst spells in the game. This is not one of the worst spells in the game. It does do some guaranteed damage. It's magic type damage. It's only a level 1 spell, so yeah, is doing 4 to 8 points of magic damage out of a level 1 spell so gross that it's one of the worst spells in the game? No. It's just bad. It's an irrelevant spell. It's not anything you'll realistically ever want to take if you're power gaming, but there's a lot of spells like that. So I'll go 2 out of 10 for cause light wounds. All right, that completes level 1 in the Divine Book. I went a bit longer to go into some of the distinctions between divine and arcane magic and tee up this whole guide. And then there was some discussion of game mechanics that's not going to repeat, like morale and resting and heal spells. At the end of the day, the choices are pretty clear at level 1. There's not much in here that's going to have relevance through late in the saga. Armor of Faith is just so clear as the best spell once you get late in the saga. And early on, there's several different spells that are helpful here. Sanctuary, Resist Fear is helpful. Command is very helpful very early on, but then loses all utility later on in the saga. And I think you're kind of looking at, when you start out the game, maybe 1 or 2 sanctuaries and then a bunch of commands dominating this level. And then for me, once I start to get tons of level 1 spell slots and I get into BG2 and TOB, it's just a whole bunch of Armor of Faiths, maybe 1 or 2 Protection from Evils, maybe 1 or 2 Sanctuaries, and remove Fears to if those are situationally needed. But this spell level kind of becomes entirely about Armor of the Faith once you get to higher levels. All right, thanks for watching the video. I'll be back with level 2, who knows when.